Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is really a final event for the ReAct project. And we have a very good lineup of speakers today. So it's a culmination of a lot of effort, a lot of expertise, and a lot of knowledge on a serious topic on cybersecurity. So how can you reactively defend against advanced cyber threats? So this afternoon's workshop will address that question, and we have a number of speakers from a variety of European organizations. ReAct is a European Commission funded project under the Horizon 2020 program. And it's one of the key projects which has come out with a key set of recommendations and results, which are very important at a time when cybersecurity is, as always, in the headlines and affecting not only companies or governments, but also individuals as well. So today's webinar will dive deeply into a number of key areas that the project has covered. We'll be hearing in a moment from Evangelos Marketos, who has been leading the project. And throughout the afternoon, you'll hear about various results that have emerged from the project. We'll also be looking at, there'll also be a series of panel discussions where we'll be looking at the current landscape, the current priorities in security in the modern world, and also looking to the future as well. So what type of next generation attacks will be threatening us and threatening Europe as well. And finally, we'll be looking at how systems can be defended as well 20 years into the future. So this is a very forward-looking webinar, and we're very pleased to welcome all of the speakers who I'll not go through each one, but we have a really nice range of speakers also from across different parts of Europe as well. Next slide, please. So we have a large number of participants and a really good mix, reflecting, I think, the cybersecurity ecosystem in particular in the world of research. So I welcome you all. I think people will also join during the afternoon for the various sessions that we have. Next slide, please. So the webinar is a collaboration also. So we also is part of the Cyberwatching series of activities, and we're very pleased to work with ReAct, who are an important project in the research and innovation ecosystem that exists in Europe today. So we'll also have a presentation later on from Cyberwatching. So I think with that we can hand over to Evangelos. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the questions box, or also in the chat as well. Use the chat, I mean, we're all sitting in our offices or at home, but try to imagine this as a physical event and, exchange ideas, exchange comments, and make sure that we make this an interactive afternoon. So with that, I'll hand over to Evangelos, and away you go. I think we may have a problem with the visualization.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, but if you have two screens, Evangelos, I think you are projecting the other one. That's maybe. Okay,
stop share now. Share screen. I'll present this one. Share. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Okay.
Can you see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to go in full mode, full screen. Can you see it in full
Yep,
screen?
perfect.
Okay, that's great. So thank you very much for organizing this final ReAct workshop with us. I'm Vangelos Markatos, the coordinator of the ReAct project. And in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to give you an overview of the project. This is the roadmap that I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about cybersecurity. Then and now, what is the cybersecurity problem? Then I'm going to discuss the heart of the problem, then the solution, who is involved in the project, and then I'm going to summarize. So first, cybersecurity. Then now. Over the past, say, 5-10 years, we have been talking a lot about cybersecurity, and I would like to pose the question, is cybersecurity a new problem? Didn't we have this problem, say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? For those of you who are older, maybe 40 years ago or 50 years ago, did we have this problem then? And before I answer this question, let me take you back, say, 50 or 51 years ago, back in 1969, and try to understand whether cybersecurity as a problem existed or not, or what. Let's see what happened in 1969. Major event, the man landing on the moon. It was a major event for science and for humanity. And actually it was computers. Yeah, of course, computers existed at that time. Computers that helped do the calculations that landed the man on the moon. So back, say, 51, 52 years ago, of course we had computers, lots of computers, and they did difficult jobs. They landed the man on the moon. Also had networks. Believe it or not, yes, the internet was invented in December 1969. Actually, it was not the internet, it was ARPANET called at that time, but basically it was the predecessor of the internet. It was not as big as it is today. It was just 4 nodes. Stanford, UCSB, UCLA, and Utah, but it was the first internet back in 1969. So back in 1969, we had computers, they landed the man on the moon. We had the internet, ARPANET, but it was the first internet. We had software, and our question is, did we have any cybersecurity issues back then in 1969? Well, the answer is yes and no. Of course, we had cybersecurity issues. If we have networks, computers and softwares, obviously we have cybersecurity issues, but it was not a major problem. And it was not a major problem first because it was a closed community. You see, the internet was used mostly by academics, so only academics had access to the internet. The internet used to run boring applications. Basically, we were doing numerical analysis, so multiplications, divisions, things like that. So it was not interesting. Computers back then didn't have a lot of value because they didn't store data, they didn't have any financial value. You didn't use a computer to access your bank account. Your bank was not online. You couldn't access it through the computer. And it was a small scale, just 4 nodes. So yes, cybersecurity issues existed, but because cybersecurity was not a major issue in 1969, the internet was not designed with security in mind. I told you, small academic community, restricted physical and virtual access implies that the internet was not designed with security in mind. And the situation did not change for quite some time, maybe say for 25 years later. The internet kept on being boring, mostly numerical analysis stuff, and kept on being a closed community. That is, mostly academics had access to the internet. ISPs didn't exist until mid-90s or early 90s. Of course, there was the occasional cyber attacks. This is the floppy disk of the Morris Internet worm. Yes, there was the occasional cyber attacks now and then, but the broader public, people out there, did not take notice because I told you, people didn't have an internet connection. They didn't have a Facebook account. Facebook didn't exist. They didn't have a smartphone. So yeah, there could be an occasional cyber attack on the internet, but that was something that was matter mostly to academics, not to the broader public. Then in the mid-90s or early 90s, something changed. And the important thing that changed is that people started connecting to the internet. The ISPs started offering internet connections. And people of all realms, not only academics, but the broader public, would have access to the internet. And then computers started storing data, lots of data and interesting data, personal data, email, photographs, gossip, financial data like credit card numbers, bank accounts, passwords to the banks, lots of interesting information. Then, in the early 2000s, things changed even more. Computers started doing things in the physical world. They started controlling appliances, controlling machinery, running factories, controlling cars. Let me give you an example. If I tell you upright in the screen, in the photograph upright, what do you see? Most people would say, I see a refrigerator here. Well, maybe one of those smart ones, but really I see a refrigerator. But the cyber attackers do not really see a refrigerator. They see a computer. They see a computer that keeps things cold. A computer that is controlling a refrigerator. But they see a computer. That computer can be attacked. When I ask you, what do you see down here, bottom right of the picture, you would probably say, I see a car, or it's one of those Google cars, maybe it's a self-driving car. But the attackers do not really see a car. They see a computer. They see a computer driving a car. And that computer can be attacked. And if that computer can be attacked, they can take control of the car. And they can do major damage in the real world. Now comes the important question. The important question is, how valuable is a computer to a cyber attacker? Remember, a computer is everything here. Up here is not a refrigerator, it's a computer. Down here, it's not a car, it's a computer. So how valuable is a computer to a cyber attacker? Well, back in the 70s, computers were not really valuable. Compromising a computer in the 70s had very little value. So what could an attacker do with it? Solve a question, do numerical analysis. So what? Today, compromising a computer has a lot of value because cyber attackers can use the computer to monetize, to gain money in several different ways, like steal data, ask for ransom, send spam, mine cryptocurrencies, lots of different stuff. And they can do major damage. A few months ago, the first ever case of a fatality was linked to a cyber attack. The patient has died after ransomware hackers hit a German hospital. Now that I explained why cybersecurity was not a big issue in the internet and why it is a big issue in the internet today, let me try to take you down to the rabbit hole and understand what is the problem. Why do we have all those cyber attacks? Why can cyber attacks compromise a computer? And cyber attackers can compromise a computer because computers are vulnerable. They contain mistakes, human mistakes. They're being built by humans and they contain mistakes, bugs. In the colorful language of computers, we call these mistakes bugs, software bugs, hardware bugs, but basically are programming mistakes, human errors left in a computer program. Hackers use these bugs in order to compromise computers. Oh, by the way, this is up here is the photograph of the first bug. The first bug was really a bug. It was an insect, moth, something like a butterfly. It was a moth, and it got stuck in a computer and made the computer malfunction. So that's why the bugs are called bugs, because the first bug was a real bug. It was an insect. So hackers find these bugs and they keep it secret. And when they manage to turn that bug, that human mistake, into a way to compromise a computer, they attack. They attack everything that can be attacked. And that day, where they attack everything that can be attacked, is called 0 day. Now, we understood the problem. We understood the heart of the problem, human mistakes, vulnerability. What's the solution to the problem? What's the solution that ReAct proposes? In ReAct, we say that the solution lies in a fundamental change of our mindset. We should change the way we think about cybersecurity. Let me give you an example. Before I tell you what change you need to do, let me give you an example. Suppose that you buy a new home and you would like to make your new home more secure. You think, oh, I'll get a secure front door, a more secure front door, a better alarm, a stronger fence, etc., etc. So you say, no. Before securing your home, try to break into it. Before trying to buy a better front door, try to break into it, because the problem may not be the front door. The problem may be the back door. The problem may be a window. So before trying to fix things, find the problem first. And once you find the problem, then try to fix it. So how do you break into your house? I advise you to break into your house. I don't know if you're going to break into your house. Will you go through the front door or through the back door? Maybe the skylight on the roof, which is a bit broken or cracked. Maybe the stone under which you store a spare key, or the garage door that opens with the remote control, or the digital assistant you can ask to open the front door or something like that. So once you know how to break into your house, then you know how to fix it. In React, we do exactly the same. We break into systems in order to know how to fix them. And how to break into systems, well, that needs a totally different mentality, because usually in computer science, when we develop programs, when we develop systems, we usually would like these systems to work. We would like to make the systems work correctly. And we actually say, no. This is not what you should do. You should try to make the systems fail. Try to find out how the system will not work correctly. And once you manage to make a system fail, then try to find why it failed and then try to fix them. Once you make the systems fail, then you know how to fix them. So how do you break things? How do you break things in computer? How you make systems fail? There are lots of techniques, and some of them are covered in subsequent talks, but one of them that is not covered, I'm going to tell you here, is fuzzing. And fuzzing basically, as you run the program with every possible input, run a program with every possible combination of values, every possible unexpected thing you can think of. That is, press all the buttons you can think of, press all the wrong combination of buttons. And once you do that, see if it crashes. If the program crashes, that's good news, because remember, in React, we would like to break things in order to fix them. So if it crashes, it's good news. Well, yeah, you may say that fuzzing takes an exponential time, but that's why research comes into place. In order to reduce the time, you need to do it in a reasonable amount of time. How else do we break things? We do manual analysis. We hack the system. It needs a lot of ingenuity and lots of hardware. This is a real picture from the lab at Universität, where they break things and they try to make systems fail. So, okay, in React, we try to break things and we try to find bugs. Did we find any bugs at all? Was that successful? Yes, actually found several bugs. University found several bugs, especially in Intel processors, a crosstalk bug that leaked sensitive data. University notified Intel about the bug, and Intel issued a microcode update in June 2020. So our processors today are safer because that bug was found and it was corrected. This is what I told you. Break the system first in order to fix it. If you break it, you know what needs to be fixed. If you don't break it, you don't know what needs to be fixed. Same thing happened with Netcat, another cache side channel attack. Other bugs, Rowhammer by University was awarded a patent on that. Other bugs from ReAct, lots of CVEs, lots of vulnerabilities found. So, to summarize, what's the React approach? We say that you should change the way you think about cybersecurity. Break things first before you try to protect. React has applied this approach and discovered 2 major hardware bugs, several software bugs, and received several bug bounty awards, filed 2 patent applications, 1 patent application here, 2 patent applications, was assigned several CVEs, and developed several fuzzing protection methods. It's involved in the project, fourth by Universität, University of Cyprus, Eurocom, ReAct, and Norton LifeLock. So to summarize, if you're going to remember one thing from this talk, is that the internet was not designed with security in mind. Because I told you, host community, there was trust, so not designed with security in mind. Now, we have to fix them. Systems contain bugs and vulnerabilities. Those are human mistakes, human errors that cyber attackers capitalize, and they turn those human errors into attacks, into cyber attacks. What's the React's approach in this setting? The React says, break the system first before you try to fix it. And React develops mechanisms to protect computers from attackers and cyber attacks. So thank you for your attention. That concludes my talk. I don't know if we have time for questions or we should move to the next talk.
maybe we have any questions for the talk. Thank you for the very fruitful introduction of the ReAct project. So if we don't have any questions, we can have questions later during the panel. The next talk will be given by Dr. Leila Biltz. Dr. Biltz is the director of the European research team of Norton-LifeLock, and she will give us a talk about patching.
Awesome. You hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. As Elias said, I am part of Norton-LifeLock, and I have been focusing a lot on the recent couple of years on risk prediction, cyber risk prediction. And actually in ReAct, we had like we kind of went beyond the expectation of our project. And we also tried to understand whether prediction can help or prediction can be made for cyber attacks. So one of the things that we kind of like thought before being able to actually identify ways to predict things in the future, one of the most crucial things is to understand actually the ecosystem very well. Like as Churchill says, you know, like if you don't know your history, you won't be able to figure out like what's going to happen in the future, right? So that's why as a first, like when we started the project, we have done a very large scale study, measurement study on enterprise security. And in this presentation, I'm going to be giving you some, results, some numbers, and I'll try to kind of come up with some interesting findings and, comment on what those findings can mean to our security. I will also kind of make some connection with risk and prediction, because some of the things were very useful for our next steps on the predictive analytics domain. So as I mentioned, we have done a very large scale study. This is probably the largest scale study that has been done on the enterprise security. It was covering 3 years of data. Obviously, right now, this is a little bit old because the data was covering from the data from 2015 to the end of 2017. So obviously, these results might have changed at the moment, but this is still, I think, will give us interesting results, and that could also lead our conversation, the conversation that we're going to have in the next panel. So Norton-LifeLock actually was part of Symantec in the past. Like a couple of years back, we have separated the enterprise and the consumer business, and this study has been done when we were still part of Symantec. So we have used actually here telemetry from Symantec. So it was covering data from 28K enterprises who had 80 million machines, and those enterprises were from 69 sectors. So obviously we had to also incorporate some public data sets to be able to make some meaning out of our data. So in the first part of the study, we have analyzed the threat landscape. We try to understand, which kind of threats the enterprises are facing with. However, we have done this thing both on the endpoint machines, and also we try to also measure how like the servers of enterprise, like public-facing servers, actually are, which kind of threats they receive, and so on. In the second part of the study, we have focused on vulnerabilities, and we particularly try to understand how fast actually the enterprise computers or servers are to be patched. So I'm going to give like more details in the following. So in this study, I'll just give like a little summary here, but I will probably focus a little bit more on some of those results. We have looked at the most common malware families that are observed in our data. We can categorize them to PUP or malware. We looked at how ransomware evolved on this period, because there were very famous ransomware families actually emerged in that period. We tried to make estimation on infection rates or malware encounter rates on the enterprise machines. Then we looked at both client-side applications, patching behavior, and also the server-side applications. And since I mentioned that this is also kind of like the role of Norton-LifeLock in this project was mainly predictive analytics, We also try to understand whether particular industry sectors are actually encountering more or less malware, or whether they actually receive a particular type of malware, so they should be more careful about them. And we also kind of like compare their patching behavior to try to see who is doing better and who is doing actually worse. So as a first, I think one of the most interesting findings that we have found was when we start doing this study, because initially, basically, you have the telemetry data, which means we know when some applications are installed. We know which kind of labels are given to those applications by Symantec at the time. However, to not rely on only one antivirus solution, we wanted to augment our data with the data that we can get from VirusTotal, so we could actually be more precise when we are saying this file is actually malicious or not, right? One of the things that we have seen during this study was that there is a lot of inconsistencies among threat labeling, and this is actually constituting a lot of problems for our domain. So obviously, sometimes, you talk about like a malware family that emerged at one point in time, and then maybe, you're not able to 100% come up with a good, estimation for when this happened, or whether the new threat actually was a new threat or was actually part of an existing threat that existed maybe for 10 years or so. Attribution becomes very difficult. And also, in particular, when you do like risk prediction, like when you want to say, I would like to measure how likely my company is to get a ransomware attack, let's say. To be able to do that, obviously, you need to have like a good, ground truth data set and a good labeling for ransomware. And we have seen that this is actually not very accurate in our study. So we have started our analysis with 14 million low reputation files. So when we say low reputation, there is like a reputation-based system that Symantec had that would flag a file as suspicious. And so what we have done, we basically queried a good percentage of them in VirusTotal, and we try to identify their labels using a state-of-the-art tool that's called AB class. And we have seen that not all of them actually were. First, a good percentage of the files are not actually found in VirusTotal. So when we are actually basing our analysis or studies only using only VirusTotal data, we might not be able to be 100% accurate, and typically that's what is available, and that's what we are doing as a community. Another problem that we have observed is that in general, AV companies are assigning generic signatures, maybe because actually it was very difficult for them to attribute actually to identify the real name for the threat family. So when you're actually trying to do analysis, you are kind of like restricted to a small percentage of the data, because not for all of the data you're able to associate a malware family. This was a very interesting result, I think, for our community in general. Another thing that we have seen is that a malware is a very important problem still, and a good percentage of the enterprise hosts are still actually encountering a lot of malware. So we had two types of estimations, which we call conservative and lax. Basically, conservative would be based on the files that we were able to flag by using VirusTotal. And lax estimation would be all the files that are actually low reputation are not benign. So obviously, kind of like only using the lax estimation as kind of saying that to measure the malware encounters would be probably exaggerated. And we believe that the reality probably falls somewhere between the conservative and lax. So what we have seen is that in general, 10% of the machines actually encounter some form of malware, and 87%, or maybe somewhere between 87 and 96% of the enterprises actually encounter at least one malware over the course of the period that we have done that out. So malware clearly is an important problem, and we should definitely figure out a way to combat with malware. So we have also done a little bit of like ranking among industries to try to see which industries actually receive more malware than the other. And we have seen that in general, if you look at the percentage of hosts that encounter malware, you know, the finance industry in general is like cleaner compared to, you know, electrical equipment or automobiles type of, you know, more critical infrastructure type of sectors would actually encounter many more hosts, which honestly is like a very, very scary result. Another thing that we looked at, as I said, we wanted to understand whether this very common concept in the financial domain could be actually applied to risk analytics. So basically, we have here two concepts called systematic and unsystematic risk. And here, like, I'll try to just simplify what it means. So can we actually guess whether a company or a host will encounter a malware based on the volume of activity only? So I would just say, well, you know, every month, statistically, you will receive a threat and you might get infected. On the other hand, whether actually this is not the real, and you know, your security posture, your behavior actually could impact the risk, and therefore, even if you know you might risk, you know, like it's not like simply computable, like you know, based on the volume of activities that you're doing. So when we map these concepts on our data, what we have seen is that for a fraction of you know enterprises, actual systematic risk could be applied, because indeed for them probably they're not really applying you know, their security behavior is not probably very proper. So basically, based on how much you're going around in your browsing and so on, you might actually get a lot of infections. On the other hand, we have also seen that security behavior actually is impacting your posture. So which is actually a good result, because it shows that there is still something that you can do. Like if you really want to, you know, fix the problems, security problems on your company, there are things that you can do. You can do education or whatever, you know, this is obviously a different conversation that we can talk about some other time. Another thing that, as I mentioned, like in our data, we only had information about the client machine endpoints, and typically this does not really cover servers. And so we wanted to augment our data by using some external, you know, data sets, blacklists, and so on, and try to see whether the IP addresses, the servers that belong to particular enterprises actually might be flagged, put in the blacklist because they are used as a command and control server or download server, or they are sending spam. So for this, basically, we had like a methodology to identify IP addresses that belong to a particular enterprise, and basically based on that, we try to identify what fraction of them actually kind of like are doing malicious activities. So the results is that we have identified a lot of you know, spammers in our data. We have identified high prevalence of malware, and we have kind of like made similar ranking compared to what we have done with the internal data. And we have seen that, you know, the kind of software, electronic equipment, like commercial services type of things are actually receiving the most number of malware. So unfortunately, blacklists are not like the ideal way to try to understand the threat landscape, but definitely is a helper if you don't have an external data. And this is generally publicly available, and most of the people can actually kind of make some estimations, even if they're not 100% accurate. So now let's talk about the vulnerability part, which I think is going to be more interesting for the panel that we're going to be having soon. So what we have actually done in our study was we first wanted to measure how you know, the patching behavior of client machines, the endpoints, and also the patching behavior of the servers. So for to be able to identify, so we basically, for the client machines, we have used our own file reputation, file appearance logs data sets. Basically, we would know the first time a particular version of these applications that we have analyzed are installed on the computers. And we would also know when a newer version will be installed, so we can actually simply calculate how long it takes actually to patch a particular vulnerability if we can associate a vulnerability with a version. In the second part, what we have done, we have leveraged internet-wide scans, and we tried to we have a number of patterns that can match particular versions of servers on the protocol banners, and similarly follow a similar analysis. We are able to basically measure when exactly actually a newer version is actually installed on those servers. So basically, we had around 2,000 vulnerabilities that we have analyzed, and a good fraction of them actually were very critical vulnerabilities. And we expected enterprise machines to be very quick to patch and update their systems so that they're not anymore vulnerable. So unfortunately, the results were pretty devastating. We have seen that in general, actually, it takes a long time to update all of the hosts in enterprise environments. Like if you look at when exactly 50% of the hosts in each enterprise is patched, it would take up to 5 months, 3 months. Like obviously, like Chrome, which is has an auto update system, is much quicker. But for some reason, even that, it would take almost 3 months to patch the whole enterprise. It could be because, some enterprises are actually blocking auto updates. We don't know exactly why this happened, because we can only make a general statistics in our data. So of course, these results seem pretty bad. Indeed, they are not so good. However, when we compared our results with the patching speed that is done on the patching speed of the consumers, still, enterprises are on average faster to apply patches, which is showing that there is a momentum, and they're more knowledgeable, or they have more to lose. That's why they're actually a little bit more careful than consumers. We have looked at we have done similar comparisons among industries, and we have seen that in general, again, the financial industries are pretty quick to patch their hosts, even though still the numbers are not so good. And the results actually are pretty similar when you look when you do the analysis, the comparison among on the threat landscape. So another thing that we have seen is that, when actually typically you do a simplistic risk analysis, you could simply say oh, your enterprise, you're an enterprise from the financial industry, so you have a low risk and you're fine. However, what we have seen is that there are a lot of, exceptions. So sometimes, even though maybe the best patchers and the worst patchers are actually maybe coming from very big, very known kind of industries, in reality, there are also some exceptions. Like, for example, in our particular data, the best patcher, which was doing patching on all of the machines, it was a pretty big enterprise. I'm not talking about this enterprise with 5 computers. That's why the patching was super quick. They were actually able to patch all of the computers at average for all of the applications in less than a couple of days. So which is coming from hotels, restaurants, and leisure industry. So it looks like there are exceptions, so you cannot really generalize. And in general, if you look at the top 10 enterprises, they would patch all of their machines, most of their machines, in less than 10 days. However, when you look on the other scale, the worst 10 enterprises, actually, it took over a year, or 1.5 years to patch all of their machines, which is obviously very scary. So let's look a little bit on the server-side vulnerabilities. We would assume that maybe, client-side vulnerabilities are not as scary, which obviously is not true. But the servers, the public facing, servers probably are taking care better. So let's see how that looks like. So we looked at over 100 server-side applications, and we kind of match, similar to the, methodology that I mentioned before. We match basically IP addresses to consumers and brought to servers, and we have seen that over this 70 million publicly accessible IP addresses, 24% had at least one vulnerable service, and they were 10% of them were affected by more than 15 vulnerabilities. And there were a lot of servers, like 1.5 million servers that actually in 12K enterprises that never got upgraded. They just stayed there like that with vulnerabilities. So the numbers are slightly better, like when you look like when 50% of the servers of a particular enterprise is patched, the numbers are slightly better than client, but still, I mean, concerning that these things are, can be attacked, they're more vulnerable, more exposed to the attackers. Still, the numbers are really not very well. So as you can see, it's like 9 months to patch all of the 90% of the servers on an enterprise. This shows that there is still a lot the community has to do to be able to fix the existing vulnerabilities. And here we're not even talking about the zero-day vulnerabilities that we try to identify in the course of our project. So we did similar calculations, comparisons, and as you can see, like the worst industry is actually doing much worse than, like 2 years to patch their servers, which is really not a very good results. So I'm going to conclude my presentation by showing this slide. Normally I use this thing like as a first slide in my presentations, but this time I'm going to talk about, like whether actually, in the human nature, we do have like a reactive behavior. So we're not, even if, we have also seen this thing during the pandemic. So unless, it comes to your next door, no one starts thinking that this is real. Like people would just say, well, it's not going to happen to me, so I'm not going to do anything for it. I'm not going to try to improve my health. I'm not going to try to protect myself. I'm not going to try to patch, problems, vulnerabilities. So I guess here, probably we should not leave this into the human's decision. So this has to be an automated process. Maybe we should even like standardize automated process and do not rely on humans anymore. Of course, we'll discuss this thing a little bit more because obviously human is always there, and whether we will be able to figure out a way to automatically do all these things. This is also an open problem, obviously. Of course, there are other problems like, when you update your server, maybe, the functionality that is not there anymore, it breaks. And that's why people are not upgrading their servers. There are a lot of elements here. I think we will discuss it in more detail in the next panel. I don't know if I was over the time. I think I'm okay, right, Elias?
Thank you, Leila. It was a very interesting talk. So, hi everyone. Next one, we have a very interesting panel assembled. I will please the panelists to turn on the camera. My name is Ilias Thanasopoulos, and I am an assistant professor in computer science with the University of Cyprus, and I will do the moderation of the panel. The title of the panel is Security Updates in the Modern World, and as you can already figure it out, patching systems is a central idea in ReAct, and also during the last talk we heard how important is this patching process and how we can see different patching behaviors in different systems. So my first question will be the following, and I will please everyone that answers the question, please give a short introduction about yourself. So my first question would be, we can see that different trends in system exploitation exist through the years. We have different type of attacks, more sophisticated attacks today. We also have more sophisticated defenses or bug fighting tools, but it seems that it's unclear if whenever we found the bugs, if it's unclear if we push the fixes in the right time, and and it's unclear if patching has equally evolved during the last decades as far as attacks have evolved and finding bugs have evolved. Perhaps we should start. No, maybe we should follow the order. Maybe ladies first, Asia.
Hello, thanks. So I'm Asia Słowinska. I work in IBM Security. And in my previous life, I was at the FU, the Vrije Universiteit, and I did research in binary analysis. So coming back to your question, I wish patching did evolve as quickly as system exploitation. However, also as Leila said, it doesn't. It does not evolve as fast as the market. And certainly, like there are multiple factors which contribute to that. Patch management still does not get support from the senior management. So it's not treated as an integral part of an IT security strategy. So that's perhaps also why certain industries do not patch that quickly. It's scary and it doesn't make much sense because patch management is the most effective way to prevent exploitation. I read somewhere recently that 99% of the vulnerabilities exploited every day are not 0 days. So if patching did evolve as quickly as the attacks, we would see less of them. However, I also hope that it will change. So these days we see more and more compliance standards like legal regulations, which just by law require a proper and auditable change management process. So we have PCI DSS, which is used by the financial organizations. We have HIPAA, which is about health. We have SOX. And I'm sure that eventually all those regulations will be also a very good motivating factor for industries. And those regulations will also contribute to an evolvement of software patching, so that eventually software patching will evolve as quickly as system exploitation.
Thank you so much, Asia. Pericles?
Sure. So you know my name, you can see it. I work with Niometrics in Singapore on network analytics for large telecommunication providers. Some of their interests are in security. To your question, on the client side, I've seen a lot of improvement because now we have browsers that auto-update. We have lots of software as a service applications which are patched, by the vendor themselves. But there's also a lot of change. So we have these mobile ecosystems which are locked down, and this tends to help. But on the other hand, we have thousands of, let's call them second-rate vendors on the mobile ecosystems. So you cannot really rely on them to patch things. Often they are even hostile to security, or they're in the gray zone, right? Even with some more reputable vendors, you have cases where the operating system vendor had to step in and patch the vendor's software because the vendor had a problem on uninstall and left, open service, right? So patching is still tricky, and we haven't seen yet the worst of IoT, I guess, because with 5G we'll get lots of IoT devices which come networked by default. You don't need to configure Wi-Fi probably. On the other hand, on the server side, I think the situation is actually worse. Okay, on one hand, we have this new kind of patch. So previously, when you have a patch, you may have to think whether you apply it or not, but you don't expect a huge performance degradation. But now with these performance-related security vulnerabilities with the CPUs, you actually have a huge performance cost, which previously was only associated with proactive defenses. Like if you make your system immune to all buffer overflows, you incur, let's say, 20% performance overhead, right? Now you fix a bug and you get performance overhead. So it's even more scary to fix things. And I think the worst situation, which has made the patching situation intractable probably, is that we have this solution to the dependency hell problem, which is the bundling of dependencies in every possible way. So we have containers who have their own set of libraries and programs in the container, right? We have static linking is very fashionable now. New languages don't bother with shared libraries because they're a problem, right? They just static link everything. So if you try to upgrade for security, you need to upgrade every program that uses a library, who knows what uses a library. Then you have even a very big application that is developed by multiple teams for a vendor may include multiple copies of the same library. And then you have, even as developers, they use vendoring a lot. So they will copy the libraries into their source code. So you can end up, with these situations where there are tools now in the market that you run on your software to find what dependencies you have. I ran this on my company software, and I was shocked at the stuff that we had that I had no idea about. And this will flag you all the extremely old and vulnerable versions. Major vendors have been audited like this, and people discovered that they have these multiple copies of the same libraries from different groups that get linked up in the same binary. So I think this bundling is a cure that may be worse than the problem. And then when we end up really solving it with all these tools that have to scan all your containers or your static built binaries or your snap application images, the solution might actually be more complicated than the problem we started with. And for patching, it's going to be quite tricky. Thank you.
Thank you, Pericles. Nicolas?
Yeah, hi everyone, Nicolas Cortelis from Telefonica Research in Barcelona. Yeah, so regarding this with the patches, what really strikes me, Odin, I think Leila mentioned it, and I guess it's a recurring issue, is how the human nature is actually going against the lot of efforts that the security industry is doing to help the security professionals and the systems. So you have the patches being released, but they take so much time to be deployed. And I was wondering if we envisioned down the road, maybe you will call me a fan of regulation, but if there was similar to, when the seatbelts came in force, well, all the automakers had to put the seatbelt because it was obliged by law. And then the accidents went down immediately. Now the deaths and everything. So if there was a regulation for the patches to be deployed within X amount of time after they get released, how many actual issues would we have in the security domain? I think we left the industry and generally the ecosystem to play on its own rules. And it seems that there is a market, there is an ecosystem that feeds itself, right? You have, of course, the security companies that release the patches. You have the companies that try to hack the systems and they create the problem. And then you have the actual companies that host the systems, and they are in the middle. But I don't see the enforcement. So the whole thing just perpetuates forever, and it takes, I don't know, you said 9 months, I think, Leila, or 1 year or 2 years in some sectors. Unbelievable, right? Yes, you can say that it's a matter of, I'm running something really, really important right now, and I cannot switch it off now and do the upgrade and then switch it on again. But, well, I mean, there is never a good moment. It's always the best moment. It's then and there when the patch is released. So I think we need to look a bit deeper into the human reaction and the way that people take on the patches, because we can solve all the problems of the security, but if they don't get applied, we'll still have the problems.
Thank you, Nicolas. Corrado?
Hi, everybody. I'm Corrado Laita. I'm part of VMware now, but until last year, I was working on a network security startup called Elastline. We were looking at basically network monitoring of large enterprise networks and protecting companies from cyber attacks. So to me, the problem with all this seems to be pretty much there is a very big long tail, meaning that you have some. So either we have companies that are actually taking the problem seriously and they are keeping up with the security updates, continuous updating the systems and involving resources, or once you fall behind, actually things become much more complicated to deal with. I mean, if you don't have the latest version of a given application, most likely you won't be able to just patch the application, will be forced to first upgrade. And normally upgrade is a very high cost because you need to upgrade your server or your web service. In order to upgrade your server, you probably will need to test your web service to make sure it still works correctly on the latest version of web server. So people in the end end up in saying, hey, this is way too difficult, way too complicated. Yes, I'm aware of being vulnerable, but I want to stay like this because updating takes time. And the longer you wait, the longer you basically procrastinate this, the worse it gets. And this is basically in a way that what I see. I mean, I remember that in my previous life, we wrote a paper in 2012, so it was quite some time ago, looking at let's say botnet activity in the internet. And in 2012, we still saw a significant amount of activity from the Blaster worm. It was something that was from 2003, so almost 10 years old, and we still had university computers and similar all over the internet that were still running super old versions of operating systems, and nobody was taking the care of upgrading them, probably because if you upgrade them, then they will become unusable or similar. So I think that we are also dealing with this issue that it's difficult to just patch. Often in order to patch your vulnerability, you will be forced by the vendor to upgrade it to the latest version of the product, and there are a number of soft problems that come with that. And this is what keeps people behind. And once you're behind, you'll be even more behind over time.
Thank you, Corrado. Anyone from the speakers wants to comment on the question? Yes, Leila.
So, yes, I mean, indeed, the picture is not very beautiful. However, still, there's, I think, an improvement over the years, honestly. Like if you look at, I don't know, 20 years ago, even the vendors will not come up with a, patch as soon as possible. They would just postpone it for a long time, right? So now at least the vendors are really, really reactive, and they try to come up with a patch very quickly. And we also see that there are a lot of the people that are serious about it, they are doing it, right? So here, obviously, there are a lot of problems as Pericles, mentioned. If you want to do this thing, I mean, if you want to be 100% perfectly secure with no vulnerabilities, super, it's complicated, and you can never maybe achieve that anyway. And if there's a serious attacker, they will be always able to exploit you in some way. However, it would be really important, I think, at least to protect yourself from existing very old vulnerabilities, because whomever actually is interested in it, they hear oh, you can earn money from exploitation, let's go for it. And they don't even know how to code yet, but they can just use existing exploits over there and start compromising millions of computers with no even effort, right? And this is gonna cause problems. So obviously, at least, I mean, statistically speaking, the bare minimum should be done, and something has to be done for it. And we should not involve basically humans in at least the bare minimum, because obviously to do the complex system, there are a lot of things. You use a service. I mean, what if the service is vulnerable? So you're vulnerable because of the service or whatever, like the library. It's too complicated. But the bare minimum should be done. And, we have to figure out a way to kind of at least improve this part of it.
Thank you, Leila.
So, Ilya, if I can add,
yes,
if I can add, maybe we could use mechanisms like those explored in the ReAct project, like the selective fortification, where somehow the program comes together with the hooks where the fortification can happen. So it's not just a plain program where you apply the patch later, but the program comes prepared and you can selectively apply fortification in specific places until the patch, the real patch, is eventually done. It's a new mechanism. It could be applied in practice, I guess.
Well, I think that's actually the best scenario, right? Like here in our project, what we are kind of having, our goal is try to be patching things before even the vendor comes up with a patch. So Obviously, I mean, there is a set of enterprises that actually look for this kind of solutions. I don't know if, at the moment, I'm not sure if there is any commercial solution for that, but at least I think there should be like a number of customers that would be actually interested in having a solution like ours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And actually, that leads to my second question. And we also have a similar question to the chat. One user from the audience asks if we consider that vendors usually produce good patches. And my follow-up question would be: do we think that we are done technologically on how to update the system or how to produce the patches, and it's only about users delaying the installation of the patch? Can we do something better in order to perhaps remove not entirely the user, but to somehow help the user to immediately patch the vulnerable system? Who wants to start? Maybe to use the same order, Asha?
Sure. So like as already Pericles said, I wouldn't say that it's a bad will of people or the IT operators that systems are not unpatched. And they always need to also judge if a patch will not introduce new bugs or if the security benefits are worth risking the potential like disruption of a service. Also, like they often need to do this outside office hours. So all those factors do not help with patching. And at the same time, I'm sure that there is more and more awareness on the market, and there are all the legal regulations which just require a proper change management process. So it looks to me like that there is a market gap, and this market gap is perhaps already being filled in a way. And I'm sure that the market will respond to those and offer solutions, perhaps something to what is done in ReAct. And like in general, the research world has investigated multiple solutions to patching, software analysis, and whatnot. So I deeply believe that those solutions will be gradually adopted by the industry, and they will make their way to production. So like I think we see a good trend right now, as Leila said, in certain industry sectors, perhaps also because of the regulations. But if we start getting products which are also easier for the IT operators to be used, they will be also adopted by others, I believe, because it will be just simpler. And so, thank you.
Okay, awesome. So, Pericles, do you envision any breakthrough in how to update the system in the future?
I'd like to rather mix this with the question in the forum, which is a bit related, whether we should decouple the security patches from the non-security related updates.
Good.
Because of course we understand that you may want to combine them to hide that there is a security fix, right? But that is a major problem, hurdle when you want to upgrade your system with a patch, because if it's decoupled and it's a really small patch, then the vendor has a reasonable chance to make the patch possible to apply without any problem, right? Your presentation that you're working on for tomorrow is not going to be disrupted if it's just a minor security patch, very focused. So they can push it out very fast. So it simplifies a lot the kind of infrastructure you need to actually apply a patch. If the vendor has a good reputation, I mean, maybe if the vendor has a bad reputation, any kind of use of their system will be unstable. So I combine these two in a way. If the vendor is reputable, they should be able to release a patch without a big impact if they focus on exclusively security patches. So those should be pushed out as fast as possible, coordinated disclosure, of course, but even automatically, preferably. And let the user take their time to bother with upgrading the OS so that the corners of the windows can be rounded instead of square, or they can be transparent or whatever. Because those things tend to break things. These changes. Thanks.
Next, Nicholas.
Yeah, so maybe a couple of points I've been pondering. One is with these software-defined networks and everything that, at least from the operator's point of view, are moving really fast into virtualized type of networks, we may see a different way to apply patches because you decouple a lot of these functionalities, and you also make them centralized, so you make them easier to be patched. So I think we are moving forward from the point of view of deploying patches in comparison to, I don't know, 10 or 20 years ago. Now, with respect to, let's say, innovation about it, I think ReAct as a project is doing a lot towards that direction. And Evangelos mentioned an example earlier. One thing that we may also consider in the future is that, yes, now we still have the personal devices like laptops and phones and so on, but this doesn't need to be the case in 10 or 20 years from now. We may actually think of the terminal approach that was envisioned, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago. But this, I think, can borrow a lot of principles from what we see now with the virtualized type of networks. And then this can also be considered when you want to deploy patches. If the smartphones or whatever we have become, let's say, dumb terminals, then you could apply a lot of the, if there are security issues, you could apply them in the centralized environment. So bottom line is that I see already a tendency in the industry and the technological sector to move into virtualized setups, which helps, let's say, deploy patches or study the problems and deploy the patches. Now, I will put a semicolon here and say that we also do see the edge, right? The edge being a new thing, and asking for more and more intelligence being pushed to the edge. So this kind of in contradiction to what I just said with the virtualized. So there is some consolidation to be done in the future.
Thanks, Nicolas. Corrado?
So, I mean, there are basically, I think multiple things. On the one hand, I mean, I think that, I think Pericles before was indeed mentioning that vendors should make sure that we always can patch without updating. So without, forcing the user to put a newer version. Unfortunately, I think this is, moves the complexity and the cost to the vendors. I mean, I can see large vendors being able to stick to something like that, effectively. But when you look at, I don't know, open source projects, or even larger, smaller companies, like, imagine myself as a last liner, right? If whenever we saw a bug or a major issue in the product, if we could go back and provide a patch for all the previous version of the product. In practice, we did that for all the versions we support at a given point in time. Already that was extremely hard to do. So in one thing that I think is probably will help a lot in the future is, on the one hand, I mean, as Nicolas was saying, virtualization. Meaning, can I make sure that even if my system is still vulnerable, I can isolate the system so much from everything else that the presence of the vulnerability has almost no impact on the overall security of my network. And the other one is that, if I look like at, microservices, Kubernetes, and similar, I think one of the main issues that people had in the past with the upgrading, especially servers, I mean, Leila in their presentation was showing that the situation on the server side is much worse than on the endpoint side. In my opinion, one of the reasons for that is that upgrading a server can be very complex, meaning that it would require, the operators to, set up a second server, update server, test it first manually, making sure everything is fine, then switch the access from the vulnerable server to the new one. All this is something that would have required, hardware provisioning and so forth in a physical world. So I would not see small companies really do these kind of things. Nowadays, in the moment in which we are dealing with words such as Kubernetes, this becomes trivial. I mean, I just needed to deploy a new pod with a newer version. I can test it first internally, then I can start routing the traffic towards the pod just a little bit at a time to make sure that everything is fine, and then I'm good. So in a way, this is also something that probably will help a lot of the situation on the long term on the securing servers. Again, we have this big inertia and this big long tail of very old servers all over the internet that will stay there for quite some time.
Thank you, Corrado. Other comments of if someone envisions a future breakthrough in updating systems from the speakers, perhaps? Any comment?
I mean, I think they have already talked very nice, come up with very nice ideas here. However, I think again, like I'll touch again on the human aspect. Like if you think about like one of those issues, I mean, we are talking about very complex ecosystem. Like we are talking about a system that requires a deep security knowledge to be able to, execute correctly, right? Mm-hmm. Even if things are known, to understand whether the patch is, kind of resulting in a new vulnerability on another component that was using that thing, right? So there are a lot of detail here. And one of the problems I think here is that, in general, the patch management in companies are done by the IT. And most of the time, people in IT are not really the security expert. In general, they are not security experts, really. So like you're giving this very complex job to people that might not even understand all the details. I think like this is another thing that needs to, we need to focus on, like, like companies like maybe making, I'm sure there are companies that do that already. I'm talking in general to, have more specialized, IT to, do the security analysis and patching and managing the patches and vulnerabilities.
Thanks. So from the whole discussion, I got that we are all envisioning a better ecosystem in the future that combines different technologies so that patches will be easier to handle and easier to be applied on our systems. So I will end this discussion with just a very, very fast question to all of you. You can answer with a yes or no. It's Monday night. I'm relaxing at home. Tomorrow I have a very busy day, a very important meeting in the morning, and I'm getting the dialog box from my operating system that a new security update is coming and I should install it immediately. Should I click yes or no?
No. Well, I mean, you have to be honest. Like, sometimes, for me, what happens, I'm receiving an update. And my kid, I need to change the diaper of my kid. Someone is screaming in the other side, and I completely forget about it. Like after like 2 hours, I'm like, I try to do my best. I'm pretty quick probably for an average, internet user, but sometimes I do know. Yeah, unfortunately, I have to be honest here.
Perhaps I should follow the advice. I must admit that I will also be very skeptical to click yes. Thank you all for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I guess we move to our next session where Cristiano is the session chair, right?
Yes, indeed. So I was just looking at the order of talks. So hi, everyone. I'm Cristiano Giuffrida, faculty at FU Amsterdam, and I'll be chairing the next session and panel where we'll be talking about next generation attacks. We have two very interesting talks today based on two pillars of next generation attacks. So we'll be talking about bugs in DRAM, specifically ROAMer, and bugs in your CPUs, specifically transient execution vulnerabilities. And we're going to start with our first speaker, Kaveh. Hi, Kaveh. He's faculty at ETH Zurich, an expert in hardware security. And he's going to talk to us about how to exploit a bit flip in order to own the cloud, specifically using ROAMer. Kaveh, the floor is yours. You can start presenting.
Thanks, Cristiano, for the introduction. Let me try to share my screen. Okay, is this working?
Yes.
Perfect.
All good.
Great.
Awesome.
Awesome.
I forgot to mention, sorry, Kaveh. So we'll handle the questions using this Zoom Q&A tool, just like before. So if you have questions for the speaker on the presentation or on the team in general, feel free to dump them in real time on the Q&A, and we'll try to pick them up if there is time at the end of the presentation, or we'll bring them over to the panel discussion. Thanks. Kaveh, floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Cristiano. And also thanks to all of you for being here virtually. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about how to exploit Bitflip in order to own the cloud. And you know, before we start talking about owning things and compromising things, I think it's best to first really define the threat model. What is it that the attacker is trying to achieve? So here is like one common threat model. I talk about a little bit about the other one or other ones later in the talk. So in this one, you have an attacker VM, right? That's trying to compromise a victim VM, right? And the assumption here is that they're sharing the underlying physical machine. I will show you that this is possible today under certain conditions with the rowhammer bitflips, right? I'm going to talk about these conditions and these rowhammer bitflips, right? So maybe first, what is rowhammer? So rowhammer, you might have heard of it. This is an issue inside DRAM, and this is dynamic random access memory. This is something that you find in your laptops, mobile phones, cloud servers. And so if you read a little bit about them, you will realize that these are made out of capacitors, very, very small capacitors, and some transistors. And to store some information, right? So you store some charge in this capacitor, right? Let's say you want to store a 1 bit, right? You store some charge, and if you store enough charge, then you will store the 1 bit. This is how you store information inside DRAM. But as I said, these are capacitors, and if you remember, your physics course from high school, capacitors leak charge over time, right? So basically what you need to do to make sure that your data remains the same and does not get corrupted over time is that you have to periodically, what we call, refresh these charges to make sure that the same amount of charge remains inside cells that have this high charge. And this happens for every row of DRAM, typically every 64 milliseconds, once every 64 milliseconds for DDR3 and also DDR4. Now, what is rowhammer? So the problem is that because of Moore's law, now we could potentially make smaller technology nodes, smaller capacitors, smaller transistors, and this is great because it allows us to potentially have a phone that is the same size, let's say, but it has suddenly 2x or 3x or many times more the amount of DRAM that we used to have, for example. So if you think of what the feature size used to be many, many years ago, maybe 20 years ago, you could imagine it to be the left side, right? And the right side, you see many years later now we have many, many smaller ones all packed in the same area. So it's great for power because you now need a smaller amount of power for each of these bits of information that you store inside your DRAM. But they also have become much, much closer to each other. And this is creating some reliability problems. So some folks in Carnegie Mellon back in 2014 published a paper that they showed that actually because they've become so close to each other, right? If you start accessing some rows of DRAM very, very quickly, what happens is that a little bit of charge every time leaks from one row of cells to the other. And if you do this quickly enough, enough charge will leak from some of these cells that the system can no longer recognize that this was actually a cell that had a high charge. So what this means from a software point of view, from a higher level in the stack, is that you suddenly see some bits flipping, right? Depending on whether you encoded a 1 bit to be the high charge or a 0 bit. So you start seeing bit flips from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0. And as a result of their study, they showed that this effect was called rowhammer. And so this affects 87% of deployed DDR3 memory back then. And later, researchers showed that this also affects some DDR4 memory, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit also towards the end of the talk. All right, okay, so this was 2014 and 2015. So me and some of my collaborators in Amsterdam, one of them being Cristiano, we were thinking about how would you actually go around exploiting these bit flips. So if you think of software attacks and software vulnerabilities, oftentimes you have these corruptions that happen in locations that you know beforehand, more or less, and usually you corrupt many bytes of information. But here the situation is a little bit different, right? So these happen randomly, right, at locations that you previously don't know where they are, and they are oftentimes single bit flips, right? So the type of primitive that you have is very much different than the ones that we were used to beforehand. So the first step that we did was actually trying to define how would you go around exploiting these things. And so we came up with these 3 steps that you need to do. And the first one we call templating. And the templating is this act that the attacker needs to do, which would be going around DRAM, trying to hammer everything, right? And try to basically find a location inside DRAM where you would have one of these bit flips. And ideally, you will find many of these bit flips, but you want them to be at a very specific location that allows you to later on do exploitation. After the attacker has found this bit flip, we would enter the second stage of the attack. And this would be what we call the messaging step. And then the idea would be that there is some sensitive piece of information, right, that is maybe somewhere in the system, and we somehow want to make sure that this piece of information actually ends up in the same location inside DRAM where we previously had found a bit flip. After we have done this, we would enter the exploitation phase of the attack. And during this exploitation phase, the attacker would re-trigger the vulnerability from before, and then this piece of data would get corrupted. So the corruption happens inside DRAM. So the CPU doesn't know about it, and most of the times we do isolation based on primitives that the CPU, mechanisms that the CPU provide us. So now we've managed to, sort of by accessing some other location inside memory, to corrupt some other location inside DRAM which has this sensitive information. So how would you compromise cloud VMs using this exploitation technique? For the first step, which is the templating, I mean, it is simple, and the only thing that the attacker needs to do would be just going through different locations inside memory that is allocated to the attacker's VM and look for bit flips. So this is the first step, simple. For the second step, the messaging step, what we relied in our attack in this feature, which is called memory deduplication. Now, this is a feature that is used in some clouds, and then the idea behind this is that you have many different cloud VMs in a single machine, and so if you think of it, they're maybe running, all of them are running some version of Debian, for example, and they're all maybe running Apache or Nginx. And you can see that, so there are probably a lot of code pages and operating system libraries and different software packages that are the same across all of these VMs. So actually, there is a lot of chance to deduplicate a lot of this content that is the same across these VMs. And this is where this feature would come into play and try to keep a single copy inside the host physical memory. And this is what we use to actually show that the attacker could move the data, in a sense, to a location where there would be a bit flip. So how would that work? So here is an example where the victim is storing some piece of sensitive information somewhere inside DRAM, and the attacker has previously found this other location to have a bit flip. So what the attacker can do is, assuming the attacker knows the content of this sensitive information, this security sensitive information, could create exactly the same page at that location where you would have a bit flip. And then the attacker would wait for some time, and then in the background, this memory deduplication process would be active, and at some point would recognize that, okay, there is a copy that is the same across these two VMs. What I can do is just basically make sure that this VM would update page tables in the background to make sure that this VM, this victim VM now pointing to this page that the attacker has created. And then, it would mark it read-only to make sure that the semantics remain correct, right? So that if one of them writes to it, then you would get an event to make sure, again, everybody gets a private copy. But now, if everything goes well, the system could release this page back to the host. So now you've basically saved one page of memory. Now, of course, the attacker has achieved what it had set out to do. Right? So the page of memory is indeed now stored in this location where previously there was a bit flip. So Now, what would be target? What would be used for exploitation? So this is where we spent a bit of time thinking. So what would be a nice target, right? So and then there are some requirements. Right? We need to know a page that the victim is using, and we want this page to be a page that if we trigger a bit flip in it, we would be able to compromise that victim VM. So we thought a lot about this, and at the end we came up with corrupting RSA public keys. So and in this case, OpenSSH. And so how the attack will look like if you trigger bit flips on an RSA public key is that, so typically, when you talk about this public key infrastructure with RSA, you oftentimes, pick two prime numbers, they're called P and Q, and then use these prime numbers to generate a public key and a private key. And then the public key, is public, supposed to be public, you give it to different people. And then the idea would be that it's very difficult to derive the private key from this public key. So what we do with this exploitation technique is we trigger a bit flip, and this bit flip turns this public key into another public key, which is one bit different than the previous public key. And then when we do this, so we had some cryptographer that helped us do the crypt analysis on this. And then what we found out that once we do this, actually, it is no longer the multiplication of these two very large primes that are very, very difficult to factorize, but instead it becomes the multiplication of many, many different primes. And they're much, much smaller primes, and then it becomes very easy to factorize it. And once we know these primes, it becomes easier to then craft a private key that would allow us to log into the victim VM. So we did this, we implemented this attack, and then we tried it 200 times with 200 different VMs, 200 different public keys. And in this plot, you can see the success rate of our attacks. So on the y-axis, we can see the CDF, and then on the x-axis, the attack progression over time. So the more VMs get compromised, you can see that the CDF is going up. And you can see that after about 10 minutes or so, more than 80% of these VMs are now actually compromised. So you can see that this shows that from this random failure that people originally thought that maybe is only a reliability problem, you could actually build an attack that is heavily deterministic and reliable. So all done. So we went to conferences and started talking about this, different conferences. And then we oftentimes get this persistent, consistent audience question, right? So they would ask, what about ECC memory, right? So you told us about cloud, but in cloud you have ECC memory. So why should I worry about this, right? And so what is ECC memory, you would ask? And then, if you take a normal DRAM and an ECC DRAM, you will find out that the ECC DRAM has one extra chip usually, or a few more extra chips. And then these extra chips are used by the memory controller inside your CPU to store some parity information. So every time you write some data to your DRAM, the memory controller calculates some parity based on some algorithm and writes this next to the data or interleaved with the data. And then later on, when you're reading this data back, it will also read the parity and check whether this data is still the same. And if not, it will attempt to correct this data. Now, how does this make life complicated? It's because now if you have a bit flip, of course, it can detect and can try to correct it. However, the original paper showed that, and a very common implementation of this is what is referred to as single error correction and double error detection. So if you get a single bit flip, the system can correct it. If you get a double bit flip, the system will attempt to detect it, and then will let you know. And then if, since this is something that cannot be fixed, the system will oftentimes just crash. Right. And the original paper showed that actually, if in some DRAM there is so much bit flip that SecDet is not able to actually fix or detect these errors. So if you have enough of them, the code will get overwhelmed, and then you get corruptions. But when we tried it, the exploitation turned out to be very difficult, and because of two reasons. So this ECC implementation, how you would generate these codes, is based on an algorithm which is unknown, right? And as a result, the guarantees of it is unknown. So this was the first problem. Any piece of hardware that you usually buy, is oftentimes closed source, and people don't know how it works. And then this is exactly one of the problems that we had. Then the other problem is that, you could trigger a single bit flip, and the chance of triggering a single bit flip is quite high, but then the system will correct it. So as an attacker, you will not observe it, right? If you manage to get lucky and trigger 2-bit flips, then the system will crash, right? So as an attacker, it's very difficult to figure out how you should trigger bit flips in a way that the system does not crash, right? Because it will very likely you will see a lot of bit flips that you don't see these bit flips, and suddenly you see a crash, right? So the question was that how could you craft an attack that is actually impactful and could compromise the system, right? So as a result of this, since we couldn't immediately do this, right, people were started to believe that actually ECC DRAM is a practical secure defense against Rowhammer. And but we knew that this was not true, right? And it's just a matter of time. So we started, trying to recover these ECC functions. Now, of course, the first problem that we immediately had was this DRAM bus. It's a very high frequency bus, right? It's more than 1 gigahertz these days. So you need to have also custom interposers, and the logic analyzers that you would need for this is very, very expensive, right? So back then I would go to, to my boss, Professor Herbert Voss, the next speaker, and I would ask, so can we buy this 100,000 logic analyzer to be able to do this research? And I would look and say, we could, but couldn't you do it a little bit with something that is a little bit cheaper, And then so this basically, we went back and started thinking about this, and at the end, we ended up with this idea of actually triggering bit flips and injecting faults with syringe needles, which end up only being €5 or so. So how do we do this? So what we do is we try to short circuit. So if you look at a DIMM, then you will find that next to each data line, you have a ground. And if you short circuit the data line with this ground, you could trigger high to low voltage bit flips. So this gives you one primitive to figure out whether the DRAM controller is center 1 or center 0. Now, I would have loved to show you a demo. We have a very nice demo. Actually, I invite you to go and see it, right? It is in this paper, you will find it. And if you do this attack and doing some math, you could actually figure out what it is that the DRAM controller is doing, and you can actually recover the ECC function. So we did that, and then the result of this was a number of patterns that you can see here on different systems that would allow you to trigger bit flips if you had that specific pattern. And we also tried it on an ECC, tried with bit flips found on an ECC DIMM, and you could see here that while ECC absorbs an overwhelming majority of these bit flips, there is still this few percentage that would pass through, and you could actually use it to exploit the system. But again, we had this crashing problem, if you remember. So we had to somehow detect these bit flips and somehow merge them without crashing the system to get silent corruptions. Fortunately, we found a side channel that you're seeing here as a result of, where on the left side, we observed that if you do a memory access to a DRAM location, which did not observe a bit flip, it will be very fast, but if there was a corrected ECC error, it would be really, really slow. So this is a side channel that allows us to detect all these single bit flips. And once we find enough of these single bit flips, we can actually merge them to get silent corruptions, to actually bypass the ECC without crashing the system. So we use this to build an exploit, and here is the result of all of this effort. And on the x-axis, is the number of bit flips that we found on different locations. Right? And the y-axis is the amount of time that it took us to actually do the templating part, right? And here you can see the name of attacks, and in the middle you can see the attack that I showed you beforehand for OpenSSH. And here you can see that it actually takes, depending on the ECC configuration of the system, anywhere between 2 hours to 4 weeks. So you can see that instead of just a few minutes, now you need hours or maybe even weeks. So I would say that ECC is probably a good defense, but if you really, really care about security, it's not going to stop attackers from exploiting Rowhammer. Okay, so I'm now going to enter the last part, and then I will finish. And so this was, about a few years ago when the DRAM vendors came and said that we actually fixed Rowhammer in DDR4. And we do it with a solution that is termed target row refresh. And then the idea is basically keeping track of rows that are very intensely activated and refreshing their neighbors so that you will not observe these bit flips. And on the right side, you will see a slide from Samsung that is basically claiming that we have now Rowhammer-free DRAM. And Samsung was not the only one. So here's another excerpt from a Micron datasheet that essentially says that we have fixed Rowhammer. And since we had seen this before many, many times, that some vendors claim that they have fixed something, we were like, okay, but you don't say how you did it. So how can we really trust you that you actually did it? right? So we started actually trying to understand the properties of this in DRAM TRR mitigations. And for that, you cannot do it from a normal PC because there we don't have access to the memory controller, cannot control the DRAM commands. So it becomes very difficult to do this analysis. So instead, we relied on, we called some hardware engineers, and then they helped us do some of the analysis with this software memory controller, SoftMC, which is an FPGA-based memory controller, and allows us to send very precise control over DRAM commands. So we run DRAM outside of the spec to do some reverse engineering to understand how TRR works. Now we did this reverse engineering for a year, and managed to create this very, very complex plot, which I'm not going to explain to you. But the result of this was that, by crafting, by deciding when to send certain commands to DRAM, and then increasing the number of aggressor rows, we figured out at some point DRAM inside DRAM, this mitigation can no longer keep track of these aggressor rows. And at that point, we start seeing bit flips again. And here are some examples of successful patterns. So instead of the old way where you would only hammer 1 row or 2 row, now you need many more rows to be able to bypass the mitigation. We tried this on 40 DIMMs or so that we had bought. So these are DIMMs, if you look at the dates that they're produced from 2015 up until 2019 when we did this research. And then we found out that actually there are new patterns that are different, that need many more rows from 9 sides all the way to 14 sides. And these patterns can actually trigger a lot of bit flips again. So this shows that you can still do these attacks. Now, so I talked about this one specific threat models. There are, of course, threat models like this as well, where the attacker would try to compromise the hypervisor. We haven't done it. There are some difficulties, especially with messaging. So it needs more research. So it's unclear whether you could reliably exploit these scenarios as well. So to conclude, so I just showed you that it is possible to compromise cloud virtual machines with Rowhammer, and it doesn't look like it is going away. It's actually getting worse because we are making the transistors smaller. But the good news, perhaps, is that it's getting harder and harder to do these things. So maybe things are slowly improving. And to also conclude, I would like to thank everybody, mostly PhD students who did most of the hard work for all this research that I just presented to you. And with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions people might have.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have time for a short question, which I see in the Q&A tool. Can you see it, Kaveh?
Let me stop share. Yes.
And then if there are more questions, of course, feel free to post them and we can pick them up.
Actually, yes, let me see. Oh, I see. There are these upcoming hardware features like total memory encryption. Do you believe that Rowhammer is solved modulo denial of service for cloud settings with features like this? That's a good question. So I think encryption alone will probably not solve it. So what you will probably they do the encryption at cache line granularity, right? So I would imagine that if you still trigger a bit flip, you instead of 1 bit flip, you will probably get corruption at the cache line granularity. So it's very much dependent on how they're doing encryption. And maybe in certain scenario, you could still do exploitation if you corrupt an entire cache line, right? And you don't even know how you corrupted it, like for example in the RSA case. Now, if they start doing integrity and encryption, then I think it might become really, really harder because then the CPU can really detect that bit flip has happened. But I think we still need to do a little bit more research to understand the guarantees there.
Okay, thanks, Kaveh. So I will ask Herbert to get started with the presentation. So our next speaker is Herbert Bos. He's faculty at VU Amsterdam, and he's going to talk about how CPU bugs work, or rather CPUs do not work. I'll leave the floor to you, Herbert. Meanwhile, I see there were potentially other questions for Kaveh. Again, feel free to post them on the Q&A tool, and Kaveh can pick those up, or we can drag them to the later panel discussion. Floor is yours, Herbert.
Okay, I'm assuming that you can see my presentation.
Yeah, all good.
So thanks. I was asked to give an introductory tutorial-like presentation about transient execution attacks such as Meltdown, Spectre, Riddle, MDS, and similar. So that's what I'll do in the next 20 minutes or so. My name is Herbert Bos. I'm from the VUSEC System Security Research Group in Amsterdam, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. If you want to know more about what we do there or about some of the things that I talk about in this presentation, here's a link to the website. Okay, so in the past few years, we've seen all of these, high-profile attacks, super advanced things coming out of the woodwork, and they hit the news, and they have logos, at least many of them, and T-shirts. For our research, we don't have any logos. We don't think logos are, what we need for vulnerabilities, but they are super advanced vulnerabilities, and there's now a family of such bugs. And the problem is that they allow attackers to violate pretty much any security boundary, including, for instance, the boundary between user processes and kernel space, which is supposed to be a sacred boundary. If you violate that boundary, you basically open the gates of hell. Okay, so this is a problem of the hardware. And the question is, what is the hardware up to? Well, it turns out, and this is probably not a surprise to anyone, that if you look at CPUs nowadays, and this is a picture made by one of our former PhD students, they've become super complex, right? There's so much functionality in there. And pretty much all of this functionality is, for the past 50 or even longer period of time, 50 years or so, devoted to performance, right? So everything is sacrificed on this altar of performance. And it's become extremely complex. And, it's perhaps a little surprising that it's so complex in the sense that you don't actually see this as an outsider, right? If you're programming such a CPU, it's essentially still the same thing. You have, as we had, 40, 50 years ago, we had, instructions then, we still have instructions, maybe a few more, but not that many. We have a handful of registers, we have some addressing modes, and that's all that we see from the outside. This is what we see, in other words, at the architectural level. But in reality, to realize this, there is a whole lot of additional magic needed, right? So there's a lot of things that are going on under the hood that implement this really simple architecture, right? So there's caching, there's some way in which the instructions are broken up and executed, and there's all sorts of optimizations, branch predictions, and so on. There's maybe additional registers, and the way this architecture, this instruction set architecture is implemented is known as the microarchitecture, and this is where the problems are. So going back to the previous slide, I've said that we've been sacrificing everything on the altar of performance. And what that means is that we now have CPUs that no longer want to wait. They don't even want to wait for instructions to finish before they start the next instructions. So instructions execute out of order, and they also execute speculatively. So CPUs don't want to wait. And if we have some code, such as this one, where there's a condition, the CPU has all of these, fantastic execution units available. It doesn't want to wait for you to calculate the condition outcome, right? So whether it's true or not. In fact, it just wants to continue executing. So it may continue executing instructions here in the body of the if then else statement, in the hope that the condition is true, right? In fact, what it will do is it will have a predictor that speculates on the outcome of the condition. So it has a clever way of trying to predict that, the last 10 times, for instance, the outcome of this if condition was true. So let's assume that it's going to be true again and start executing these instructions so that by the time we actually know that this was the right outcome, we'll have the results available. And then, we save a little bit of time. Okay. And of course, we may be wrong. Maybe we speculated wrong. The prediction was wrong. And in that case, we have to squash the results. Okay. So in other words, these instructions, when they're squashed, are essentially transient. They are there and then they're not, they disappear. And there are many ways in which this happens. So the speculative execution, like I said, if there's an if condition, we speculate, on the outcome of the if, and then we start executing these instructions here, or maybe some other instructions there. And we do this by means of predictors. And the predictors have essentially some table on the processor that indicates for each of the instructions here, right? They have an entry in a predictor table, some sort of predictor table that says, I'm going to predict that the outcome of the if condition here is going to be true or it's going to be false. Okay, so that's a prediction that is made on the basis of what happened previously. Okay. And if we get it wrong, we have to squash the results. And that's not so bad. It just means that we are a little bit less efficient. Oops. Okay, but we also have this for other things, right? For instance, for jumps to an address that is calculated at runtime, an indirect jump. We also have this table that says, for the instruction at this address, you know what? Last time we jumped to, address so-and-so. Let's assume that we're going to jump to that address again. So again, we have this predictor table that has that information. Same for if we have a call to a function that is calculated, right? So there's a call to some address that is calculated by the program, and we say last time, the last few times we call to that particular address, let's assume that it's going to call there again. So we can speculatively start executing at that location. And it's implementing this, so the CPU is implementing this table quite efficiently. So it's using part of the address, part of the virtual address, to index the table. So it's using the address of this instruction, takes part of that, and then says, it's this entry here. So essentially, this is a really small cache that is a predictor. And it also means that some instructions, multiple instructions, that have some part of the virtual address in common will map to the same entry here. Okay. And it also means that you may come to this instruction here and look in this table and find a prediction that really corresponds to a different instruction, which is at this address, for instance. But that's fine, because if we predicted wrong, we can still squash the results. So in the worst case, what we'll have is we have a misprediction. Okay, there are many other types of speculation, and there's speculation everywhere in CPUs. But let's have a look at these simple cases with the conditions and with the indirect calls in this particular case. Okay. Because what we can do as an attacker, so these are the snippets of code that we saw earlier. What we can do as an attacker is manipulate the predictors and cause a misprediction ourselves, right? So for instance, we can, if this is code in our victim process, we can call that code, we can call the victim with an index that is inbound, that is small enough so it's always okay. The condition is always evaluated to true. Oh. And that means that we can execute this code. And the predictor, after having seen this a number of times, will then say, well, you know what? The next time I'm also going to predict that the outcome is true. But the next time we call this code with an index that is larger than bounds, that is out of bounds. In that case, we still predict this code to be true, and we start executing this code transiently. So at some later point in time, we'll discover that this was wrong, and we have to undo the results. So, it disappears, but this code will be executed and will do an out of bounds access during transient execution. Similarly, we can make a misprediction happen in this case by simply doing an indirect call with an address that maps to the same entry in that predictor table, and then pollute that entry so that it will mispredict here. Now, you may say, so what good does that do the attacker? Because after all, this is transient execution. This will all be squashed. Nothing will be visible. Well, almost nothing. At the architectural level, nothing will be visible, but there is still a trace. There is a trace at the microarchitectural level. Okay. Going back to the code example, if we have our case where we provide an index that is not in bounds and there was a misprediction, we'll execute this code transiently, but this transient execution will do an out-of-bound access and then use that code here in another array access. Okay, this is executed transiently and the results at the architectural level will be removed, but this code is still loaded in the cache, right? So, and that is still there. This is at the microarchitectural level. So the data that is loaded from array 2 will be loaded in the cache. So it leaves traces at the microarchitectural level, in this case, in the cache. And remember, a cache is what we use all the time when the CPU accesses memory. This is a really slow process. So all of these accesses will be cached in really fast but small memory that is close to the CPU. Okay, and this data will stay there until this cache entry is needed for something else, right? So the cache is very small, so there's only a limited space there, but it will be used until that space is needed for something else. And the way it works is that every address in memory maps to a particular area in the cache. And I've simplified things a little bit in the drawing, but let's say that all of these places map to the same entry number 5 in the cache. So we may have cache line 5 here, which contains data from first location 0, and then the program accesses location 1, it throws out location 0 data and loads location 1 data, then location 2, and then it accesses location 1 again, so it overwrites whatever was there. That's how a cache works. That's probably what you all know already. So the question is, so what? Well, let's go back to this code snippet. And here we see that with this secret data that we got using an out-of-bound access, we access some more memory in array 2. Okay, and I said this leaves traces in the cache. So what we can do is, assuming that array 2 in this case is a shared array between the two security domains, we make sure that all of array 2 is removed from the cache. For instance, by doing a lot of other accesses so that the cache is occupied with other data. Okay, so that means nothing of array 2 is currently still in the cache. Now, if we now execute this code with our out-of-bounds access, we access a secret and store that in data and use that data as an index for array 2, it means that array 2 element at this offset, at the offset determined by the secret data, in this case times 4K, but let's ignore that, that will now be cached. Okay, so all the assignments to data and val, they're squashed. There's no architectural results visible. This is still cached. Moreover, it will be the element that corresponds to this offset in array 2. So what we can do now is, as an attacker, this was a shared array between the two security domains. We can now iterate over all the elements in array 2, and all of them will be slow because they're not in the cache. They have to be fetched all the way from memory. Okay, all except one, right? Except the one that is cached, that was cached because of the transient load, the transient memory access. Okay, so we time the accesses, and one of them will be fast, and that one of them will be determined by the secret data. So in other words, the number of the table entry, the offset in the table, the index into the table, determines the value of the secret byte. Okay, so that's how we can leak this information. We use a cache side channel. Now, transient execution happens because of many reasons. So there is the control speculation that I showed in the example. There's also data speculation. There's, the CPU detecting likely invariant violations. And then there are exceptions that occur. For instance, a well-known example of that is you as unprivileged user code try to access some data in the kernel. So the kernel may have its pages mapped in your address space, but you as a user process should not be able to access that because you don't have the supervisor bits set. It should not be accessible. But you can still try to do so. It will just generate an exception. But before this exception is architecturally visible, your CPU may already be using the result, right? So you do an access, it takes a while, so it's not allowed, it's a fault, but it takes a while before this is architecturally visible, and this result is used in the meantime. In exactly the same way as what we saw earlier, this leaves traces in the microarchitecture. Okay, so this is, for instance, what was used in the meltdown attack. The previous one was more Spectre, and this is the meltdown attack. Really, really simplified. Okay, and what's important to realize is that these meltdown and Spectre attacks were not a one-off. Since then, we found all sorts of very interesting, advanced, and dangerous vulnerabilities. So new variants of Spectre, but also more attacks, more vulnerabilities that use this exception-based method. For instance, there's what is known as L1TF or foreshadow. There's also one that we discovered, which is Riddle or MDS. There are also some really weird ones that don't actually fit in either category, at least not immediately, such as crosstalk. And then there are some, interesting new causes that that we recently found and are currently still under embargo, so I can't talk about that. Okay, but let's talk about Riddle, because that's one of the vulnerabilities that we found at VUSEC. All I'm going to do now in the remainder of this this presentation is show you a brief demonstration. So the demonstration will try to leak the etc shadow file, the contents of the etc shadow file, which should not be accessible to a non-privileged user. So etc shadow contains the hashes of the passwords, for instance, the root passwords, and that is what we're trying to leak. So here we see that, let me just, oops, can I stop? Okay. So here we see that we look at etc shadow and we get a permission denied. Okay, but if we look at it as a super user, we get the root, the hash of the root password. And now what we do is, as a non-super user, so not root, we, as a non-privileged user, we run the hack password. And we're trying to find the hash of the password for root. And you can see that it very gradually finds all of the bytes that are indeed in the etc shadow file containing the hash of the root password using the Riddle attack, the MDS attack. Okay, and this is a somewhat older version of the exploit. Nowadays, it's much faster still. Okay, I don't have time to explain the details of MDS/Riddle, but you can see that it is actually a serious security breach. All right, conclusions. The implications of these CPU vulnerabilities that are not really bugs at an architectural level. They're just vulnerabilities because we can infer certain things about microarchitectural state. These implications are still unclear. We don't fully understand how they interact with many other types of attacks that are possible. For instance, how they interact with, I don't know, normal software exploitation. We still have fairly limited knowledge of the issues, even of the causes for transient execution. So there is some work on this, but some of this is still under embargo. The mitigations that are out there are limited, and the CPU vendors know that they cannot easily fix all of these issues. Okay, and that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that it's super expensive to do all of these mitigations properly. And then there are some mistakes that are made. So if you want to know more about, there's one particular saga here, have a look at MDS attacks that explains some of the, ongoing, new updates, and new embargoes. The other problem is that many of the hardware vendors play sort of security by obscurity, hoping that nobody will find certain issues, and then exploit whack-a-mole. So they wait until something is actually exploited, and then they fix just that, a spot mitigation for just that. And often they do not consider, threat models are being combined, such as, what can we do if we have Spectre and a regular memory corruption attack in software? Okay, and that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, so I don't see questions in the chat. Let me see if there is a raised hand, I think. Pericles.
That's me. So my question is, which is the most recent CPU that is unaffected by these vulnerabilities, or are they all affected?
I don't think there's currently any CPU that is not affected by at least some of the vulnerabilities, Pericles.
Even historical ones, right? That's what I'm asking.
Oh, you mean the older ones that don't have this? Okay, so you'd have to go back quite a long way, right? So you don't want to have any of the optimizations based on out-of-order execution and speculation and so on. I don't know what the latest one is there.
What about branch delay slots where you do very explicitly the speculation? Would those be safer?
So there the compiler fills it in, right?
Yeah.
Assuming the compiler, well, it depends on what the compiler does there, right? So, but so if the compiler does something that is violating security boundaries, which leaves a trace in the microarchitectural state, it could still be an issue. Yes.
Yeah, of course, but they could disable it.
Yeah,
the
that's
compiler.
right. Yeah, exactly. So it's easy, much easier to fix. Yes.
Okay,
but
so
of course, I mean, just so even the newer CPUs with the fixes applied would probably be faster than the older CPUs. But anything that is absolutely secure, how back would you need to go?
Yeah. Although some of these fixes are truly expensive, right? So the load value injection (LVI), if you really want to fix all of that, it's horrendously expensive, right? And therefore, I think in general nobody applies all of the mitigations.
Yeah. Thanks, Herbert.
Sure.
Okay, interesting. We're already getting into some of the discussion that will have in the panel next. So I would suggest we do just that. So Herbert, can you stop sharing perhaps? And meanwhile, I'll start sharing some of the questions for the next panel. While Herbert, perhaps you wanna quickly answer the question in the Q&A tool. So that should be a short one.
Okay, I'll type this in. I'll think
about
it.
Okay.
Because
all right. Yeah, that's good. Let me start sharing. Okay, can you see the slides? Okay, very good. So, okay, welcome to the panel session on next generation attacks. Again, I'm Cristiano. I'll be moderating this session. I have prepared a few questions for our panelists, and you know all of them already, so no need for introductions, I suppose, at this point. So it will be Asha, Herbert, Kaveh, Leila, and Pericles, part of this panel on next generation attacks. So as I was saying, I prepared a few questions just to get the discussion going, but please feel free to use the Q&A tool and post new questions, and we'll be posting this to the panelists in real time. We'll also try to keep the panel a little bit shorter than the originally planned, perhaps in the program, so that we can have at least a break of 5 minutes or so after a long program. Okay, very good. And meanwhile, the questions are coming in, so feel free to grab any of the questions and type an answer, or we'll pick up some of those live. So okay, so let me start with the first question. I would not go around all the panelists for answers, but I'd rather offer the question to anyone who wants to answer first, and then we'll get the discussion going from there. So the first question is about these crazy next generation attacks that we just discussed, and we had presentations on in the last session. So some people think that these crazy attacks are constantly setting the world on fire, especially the researchers involved in the field. Others argue that their impact is instead super limited in practice and we shouldn't care. So the question here is, what's your impression? What is the correct answer? And more importantly, how do we determine the correct answer here? So who wants to start?
I can say a very general thing, okay? I'm not an expert in these crazy next generation attacks, but what I believe is that if these attacks are proven to be working, they're not anymore crazy and not next generation for sure, right? So the thing is, depends how you actually measure the impact, right? So would, like the attackers choose to typically use the most simple solution to compromise. They don't want to spend too much effort to get, if they can do it in a simpler way. However, it all depends on, the motivation of the attacker, what they want to compromise. Like maybe simpler attacks would not be as possible for some cases, some situations, and they will need to do this crazy next generation attacks to do what they need to do. So in reality, I think, in security, any type of, so the solutions has to be there for any type of crazy next generation attack, like it's always, impact is always there. So even if maybe, like the victim is one person, one entity, one company, whatever it is.
Can I also maybe respond? Because I think there's two things that I want to say here, and one of the things is I feel strongly about, right? So first of all, I think these crazy advanced attacks, they actually help us understand what these systems that we built really are doing or can be doing. What it is that we built, which we don't understand anymore. They're super complex. So it's great for helping us understand the systems and help people make them aware of the security or the lack of security of the systems that they trust. The other thing that I worry about, so everybody, I frequently hear that people say, this never happens, right? So in our data set of attacks, I have a whole data set of malware. None of them uses this kind of attack. So there's exploit kits, they don't have this. But how would you know, right? So I don't think it's overwhelmingly used, but I'm not convinced about these armchair experts that say, look, we do not see these attacks in our data set. Have a look at our data sets. Look, there's not a single one. But these data sets, they are limited to in what they have. In fact, they have been gathered in a certain way that doesn't catch these kinds of attacks. So I'm a little bit worried about this.
No, I agree.
Survivor bias.
Sorry, at the end of the day, to be able to identify whether those attacks exist or not, there has to be like a solution to detect whether those attacks. I mean, exactly. If you don't have it, how do you even say that? And typically, this these big telemetry data sets just talk about it can give you statistical results. It will not talk about this 5% time. Maybe it's 100%, but indeed we don't know. We can't say. So exactly. I agree with you 100% on this.
But I also think that all this research and all those attacks show us teach us a very important lesson. We really have to think about a paradigm shift in the manner we all address cybersecurity. We more need end-to-end holistic cybersecurity capabilities. We cannot only think of using one simple, or not simple, but one complex antivirus solution. We need to think about end-to-end technologies to monitor cyber threats, to how to utilize this technology, how to teach people how to do like more collaboration on the national and international level. So I think it's like, no matter if those attacks are real today or not, or if they can only be, like as Herbert said, they show us that there is so much we don't understand. And if we don't understand, we are better safe than sorry. We try to think how to implement much more holistic end-to-end security rather than focusing on just network monitoring.
Well, I can say that I don't know about the attacks, but the mitigations certainly set the world on fire. Imagine you have 1,000 servers and you have to pay 10%, right? So I think we appreciate if you can enable these things on demand, because maybe some scenarios you can decide that they're not necessary. But even there, I mean, you demonstrate that you read the password file, right? Even if a server is not expecting to run foreign code, you still don't want to have such an easy escalation from non-root to root. So it's reasonable for customers to demand that these mitigations are in place. And unfortunately, offering a simpler vulnerability doesn't count as a solution. So we think we have to fix them. There's no way around this. So I just hope that future CPU architects will be a bit more careful with this, because basically they sell something that they didn't really sell, right? The performance that is
like all the cover channels is something no one took into account, right? It wasn't
completely unknown, right?
Yeah, so there's also a question in the chat, not in the Q&A tool, along these veins on the mitigation side, right? So like, in this spectrum, how far will you have, how far, the general high level, the question is, how far are you willing to go to mitigate these issues? Because this is much of the debate. I think the debate, for instance, if we look at, mainstream, open source solutions, Linux kernel and so on, right? In these large projects where there was the massive deployment of these mitigations. Over time, the debate shifted towards, yeah, but if the performance of the system makes the systems unusable, what do we do? So that's, this is also an interesting question. How far are you still willing to go and, in mitigating all these issues? Because often each one of these issues, it needs, spot pair attack vector mitigation. So that's, that is tricky to actually establish in practice. So the price you want to pay.
It perhaps also depends on who you are, right? If you are a government or a critical infrastructure operator, you have to pay the price. If you run a shop selling shoes, perhaps.
Can I ask a question? So I'm sure you've all seen the James Meeken's Monitorama talk, right? So there is this Mossad and no Mossad threat model, right? So do you think if you have a Mossad threat model, does it actually make sense to have all of these mitigations on, right? Or will there always be a way to break into the system?
Nobody has an answer because nobody wants to face Mossad. Is that the...
I mean, I guess it's a matter of cost, right? At the end, you pay a cost and you get some security. But I guess
I think the problem is that we already installed various chat apps and what else, so this wouldn't change a lot of the equation. But in principle, I think yes, we should, if that's the third model.
I think we're not going to be able to keep the Mossad out, right? But I think nowadays these so-called super advanced attacks are, a little bit below the level of Mossad attacks. So this is now, something that you can actually do almost as a, a reasonably advanced attacker, but not necessarily state level. And therefore you need to protect against this.
Okay, nice. Perhaps it's time to move on. So let's switch to another question for the panelists, and let's talk about next generation attacks. So this session is called Next Generation Attacks, and this was probably true in the course of the project or so, past few months/years. But surely there will be a next generation of sophisticated attacks. So any idea? Does anyone want to make some prediction here, knowing that all the predictions in computer science are wrong, so you can be wrong.
So we can confidently be wrong. So
exactly.
This could be something that we already know about, but we really underestimate the impact, right?
Yeah.
So I think the general category of information leakage through radio, like be it Bluetooth or 5G or 3G that you still have to support, can be a risk. Imagine, for example, these AirTags that were released recently. They probably have a bunch of interesting attacks coming up in the future, whether it's something we know today or whether something through the new uses that we're going to apply them into, we discover something new. Also, I think some of the trust that we place in various organizations might be incorrectly placed there. For example, we trust very large telcos, right? Because they're a big organization. But at the wire level, the interfaces used for roaming, they're wide open for attacks. They may be used by nation states now, but now we have virtual operators that NVMOs that can be much less trusted than your major brand telco, and these things interface over the same insecure interfaces. And even if there are solutions, let's say with 5G core, we still have to support the old systems, because you don't want to go to a foreign country and use your 3G phone and not be able to roam, right? So there could be attacks there. And this may become worse if we have IoT devices that are talking all the time inside everything, like Professor Marcato's fridge, for example. It will be internet connected, but not just the fridge, all the devices like the scales, the bags, the shoes, and just from the leakage of information, may not be directly not decoding the data, but just the activities that you can pick up, whether from the virtual operator or some operator, or whether just by snooping the radio with SDR, software defined radio, could be interesting attacks. So I'll make this guess.
Nice prediction. Does anybody else want to venture in predictions, in wrong predictions only?
I can also try. So for hardware, transistor scaling is a problem, right? So I think now CPUs are observing random failures, inside different components, such as ALUs and caches. But this happens at very large scale. So, at Google and Facebooks of the world, right? You see that they report in their papers that, we see so many of the computations failing because of their failures, right? And I wonder whether, the next thing that could be possible is whether to actually make these reliability problems into actually exploitable attacks, right? So, but of course, I don't know. The question that I have is, how do we even do this type of research in academia, right? Because if you need 1,000 servers so that one of them would see failure, once every week, how would you be able to even do this type of research?
Nice. Some more wrong predictions from Herbert, I guess.
Sure, I'm always good for wrong predictions. So I think there's at least some interesting future for combinations of threat models that we currently have, right? So the advanced, what we consider advanced attacks now, combined with other stuff, I think there's a bright future ahead of those, because sometimes we do not see the implications, right? We think of threat models in isolation. And in reality, when we combine them with a different kind of threat, it might actually open up some interesting new scope for it. The other thing that I believe, and I think this is also in agreement with what said earlier, we should look at is new features, right? So these new CPUs come out with fantastic new features, and the security implications are not always clear. One example of that was direct cache access that was added to Intel processors a while ago, which just looks like a nice way of doing an optimization for performance, but it turns out to have implications for remote cache side channels, as we showed. I think there's probably a ton more, because there's so many features these days, because these CPU vendors don't know what to do with their transistors. They can't just crank up clock speeds anymore. So they will just add new features. And these features are, I think, fertile hunting ground for security researchers.
Interesting. Anything else to say about this question? Or should we move on to the next one? Okay, let's move on, perhaps. Okay, so these are more like researchy and questions, so maybe interesting for this crowd. So what we've seen is an escalation of these crazy so-called next generation attacks in the past few years, say in the past 5 years, and then especially an acceleration in the last 2 or 3 years. And what this has done to the community of researchers, both the hackers community and academia, is that we have significantly increased the focus on offensive security research. And then if you talk to people in the community, some argue that this excessively comes at the expense of the defensive security research, especially in academia, while others argue that this is actually the best kind of defensive research because with these high impact attacks, often vendors care and deploy mitigations immediately. So how do we get this balance right? What should we focus on? And what is the right balance here? Who wants to take this one? I want to hear from both academia and industry. And again, wrong answers only.
Okay, so I don't have a great insight here, but since nobody's replying. Okay, of course, I'm also tired of all the attack-specific domains and logos like Herbert, but it's true that the vendors will not do anything unless they're challenged. And I can also see that academia could focus on attacks. We don't have to do the work of the industry, right? So it's okay. The industry will handle the defenses. Yeah, academia can handle the attacks. It's fair play.
That's an interesting take. I had not heard that before. That's cool.
Yeah, that's true. That's a unique take. Pericles, maybe it's easier because you're no longer in
you can have fun now that you're in research, but then when you move into, let's say, industry.
So I had the feeling that this is the take of somebody who's not in academia right now and doesn't have to worry about publishing defenses, but okay.
I mean, obviously it's preferable to get both, right? You have like an offensive paper, and I prefer to see it, the solution as well. Like, if you come up with like an open problem that impacts hugely, I mean, yeah, could be a little bit dangerous, right? Sometimes.
Yeah, but I think that since we have this discussion right now, it means there will be more and more reviewers who will just start rejecting attacks papers, and then defensive papers will come next. So I think it will just balance itself out.
So it used to be the case, I think, that if you have an attack paper, so first of all, you're at a disadvantage in the past when you have an attack paper, because the security conferences didn't like them very much. But if you wanted to publish your attack paper, you had to at least have a defense with it, right? Or explain why a defense is not possible. And I think in that sense, we've lowered the bar for attack papers. And now it's enough to have something really cool that allows you to break all of the, Intel CPUs or, Samsung DRAM chips or so. That's enough without, worrying about defenses whatsoever.
Yeah, but the impact of those attacks is very high, right? Because it's not a minor device, but if it's Intel.
Yeah, I understand the impact is great, but this is, I think, this has helped create this environment where defenses are, judged by different standards, I think.
But you have embargoes and you have processes in place, so it's not Wild West, right?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the embargoes either, by the way.
Yeah, you have these very long embargoes that create other problems. So, but that's maybe a discussion for another panel. It could take an afternoon. But Kave, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I just was wondering that wouldn't it balances itself, right? I think, I mean, so as Herbert said, right, in the past we had a lot of defenses. It was hard for attacks, and now it's like attacks, because maybe we don't understand the attack surface, so it's really easy to basically, or maybe I shouldn't say really easy, but maybe a bit easier to do attacks. But at some point, there will be more and more of these spot mitigations, and then, the attacks become harder and harder, right? So it becomes then maybe the pendulum at that point swings back, and then it becomes maybe a little bit more favorable to do more defensive research. So that's my take.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So the free market mentality of academia also applies to to this problem, and maybe we should let the problem solve itself. But this is a real problem nowadays, where defenses and maybe I think we had a backup follow-up question on this.
Maybe on this note, I just want to say that it is a problem, at least for our group, because we try to do as much defensive research as offensive research. But these PhD students, they get frustrated, right? They actually leave. Some of them leave academia because their papers keep getting rejected, and they're interesting papers. But there's always some reviewer that says, yeah, but it doesn't defend against some corner case X, Y, Z.
Yeah, exactly. This was the next question, indeed, right? So in terms of balancing judging papers and research, the challenge is also that beyond like the free market mentality and so on, the challenge is also that defenses are judged against covering all the possible scenarios where attacks are judged they have to work in a single scenario, right? So there is a natural imbalance there, which favors attacks, I think.
Yeah, so I think that if a defense improves on the state of the art, maybe in just one dimension, it's still worth publishing, because you need to map out the design space, and maybe the next defense can combine defenses or expand the coverage. Of course, if it's completely worse than anything before, maybe it's not worth publishing, but it shouldn't necessarily require complete coverage of every possible angle. That is different from actually deploying something in industry, though. In industry, you wouldn't deploy something if the coverage is really low. But I don't think that the criteria should be the same for industry and academia. In academia, you really need to map out the design space and do incremental improvements. And as long as you find something new angle, somebody didn't see this possibility of defense, you should publish it, and it should be accepted.
I think also,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ezia.
So I was going to say, I think, like in general on defense, I agree with you 100%, right? I think, although on top of that, it has to be, the solution, I think, needs to be kind of robust enough, to evasion. You can't like simply just change something simple. It's hard. I agree with you. Like, you come up with an attack. For one thing, you break systems, but to, protect the system, you have to be complete, and it's harder. And that's the reason why, our papers get, rejected. Also, I think ourselves, we're very critical, like people in our domain, we are ourselves doing the same things, right? So we're not really like forgiving, like for little problems. But I think robustness is like probably the most important feature. You can't just like change a bit and okay, your thing doesn't work anymore.
I think also reviewers don't like too many incremental approaches. Like very often, the contribution, like if the contribution is too delta or too minor, the paper is rejected just for that. Which also, is on the one hand is very much justified, but on the other hand, like as Pericles suggested, incremental solutions would be also helpful. They just will not get through these days. So
I love
the problem is open. If the problem is still open, you need to keep pushing. And on the research angle, I really don't think that the solution has to be complete, because even a partial solution may actually expose something that is of interest, and then you can combine solutions. Maybe you will combine 10 years of solutions. What if you don't have the research to look into all these variations?
So I completely agree with Pericles, and I also think that, so one problem that we have as a community is that we are obsessed with these single-digit performance overheads, right? Then we kill papers if the overhead is not below a certain number, right? And I think this is a problem. I think we should really like think in terms of, okay, if this defense, solves some part of the threat landscape that other previous defenses did not do. And then if it does that, then it's okay if the overhead is high. Maybe future work could improve it. But basically aiming to solve both problems at one go, I think it makes it very, very difficult to publish these things.
I agree with everything that's been said so far.
Very good, very well said. Now we just need to convince all the other academics to play ball. We'll see if we succeed. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. I suggest we break here. So it's 5 minutes out of time, but then we get a break of 5 minutes and we continue with the next session at 3:40. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Oh, hi. Lucas is funny. Lucas zegt het publiek. Lucas. Iets zeggen. Lekker eten, lekker eten. Ja, je moet er last van. Laat het binnen goed.
hondje wil graag, maar ik...
Ja, maar bravo, Luca.
Okay, yeah, then welcome back from the break. My name is Thorsten Holz. I'm a professor at Ruhr University Bochum, and I'm now chairing the last session, in which we again have 2 talks and then a panel. And we start with a presentation by Nicholas Ferguson. He works at Trusted Services and is also involved in Cyberwatching.eu. The title of the talk is Understanding the Cybersecurity Research Innovation Landscape. Welcome, Nicholas. I hope he's here.
I am here, yes.
Yeah,
And I'm just trying to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you for the nice introduction. Yeah, so my name's Nick Ferguson and I work for Trust IT Services. We're an asset which focuses, our expertise lies in communications. We deliver the Horizon Results Booster for the European Commission, the dissemination services there. And we also work in the field of cybersecurity as well. I coordinate the project Cyberwatching, which is a coordination support action which has been running for the last 4 years and is coming, unfortunately, it's coming to an end because it's been a good and very interesting project. And today I'm going to talk about well, understanding the cybersecurity research and innovation landscape. It's one of the main objectives of our project in terms of our role is in terms of helping the coordination and supporting projects to collaborate together. But first of all, we work with projects such as ReAct and all of the projects really funded in the cybersecurity unit. We do events like this. Tomorrow we have an interesting webinar with one of the clusters of projects that we support, which look at cybersecurity in the finance sector. So we have some important projects here like Infinitech, which specializes in the finance sector, and Concordia and Cybersecurity Europe, which are particularly important because they are one of 2 of 4 competence center pilot projects. So it'll be a good webinar. So I'd encourage anyone who's interested in this critical infrastructure sector to follow that tomorrow. So thinking about the landscape, I've got some numbers here, and I wondered if anybody knew why they are relevant. I mean, you can think about it. Obviously, nobody's going to shout out, but so these are all basically related to how much funding has gone into the topic of cybersecurity and privacy over the last 15 years. So there have been 115 EC open calls on the topic, which were either explicitly supporting projects in the domain of cybersecurity and privacy, or from which projects were supported on that area. That's to the tune of 1.1 billion euro, and now accounts over 280 projects funded. So that's a hell of a lot of activities, a hell of a lot of projects, and a load of organizations which are contributing in consortia, just like ReAct, with different experts from around Europe. So it's quite a lot of information. You need to visit, if you want the bird's eye view of everything, you've probably got to go and find some policy report, or you're going to go and have a hunt around Cordis, which generally has the information published at the beginning of a project, or you can go and visit the over 280 different websites. So it's quite a large landscape, and this is one of the gaps that our project has tried to address. So how can you address it? Well, we have a series of deliverables reports basically over the last 4 years, where we started to map this landscape and make sense of them. So we created a radar. We had a series of segments we tried to break up based on a cybersecurity and privacy taxonomy identified by Oxford University Cybersecurity Centre, and that's a taxonomy for focusing on research. But basically what we produced was a report, which was very interesting, and a nice image, which you can kind of see below. So then we started thinking, how could we make this a bit more interactive? So we created a tool, so it was a bit more attractive, and we were able to publish it on the website, manually inserting data. And then we thought, what if we could make this interactive and actually a key reference point, providing a bird's eye view of the research sector, let projects manage the data here alone and upload their information and keep it relevant, because of course the radar is only as relevant as the data inside it, and if that's old, then that's not going to be particularly interesting. So this is what we've created, and this is something which I'd like to show you today. It's a resource that I know that a lot of researchers on the webinar today, or PhD students, we've heard mentioned a lot. And this is a useful resource for understanding where funding has been placed by the European Commission and what stage these projects are. So before we go any further, I'll show you just some important aspects of the radar. So first of all, it's divided into different segments. So as I said, the segments are based on a cybersecurity taxonomy created by the University of Oxford, and you can see them listed here. They are purposefully high level because one of our key objectives of a project was to identify meaningful clusters of projects, either on technology priorities or on vertical sectors, or on maturity and market readiness. So the radar is divided up into these segments. The next point is that you will have seen that there are these gray concentric rings. Now these rings represent the life cycle of each project. So depending on where the project is in its lifetime, they are plotted in the radar. So they start in a typical life cycle process at an assessment stage where the project is running and has over 6 months to go, trial, which means the project has less than 6 months to go, and adopts, where they have less than, I think those lines are mixed up, I'm terribly sorry. So assess is the first stage, the project's just been funded. They have over a year to go, then over 6 months to go, then trial is between the end of the project and the final 6 months, and adopt is that part where the results are ready and they've just kind of finished. So then we go on to hold and drop, where the different these are the different stages of a typical project life cycle. Apologies for that error there. We also have blips. Okay, so colored blips, which basically focus on the project's performance. So this is based on a self-assessment which projects have carried out. And they've basically been asked a series of questions, and they've carried out a self-assessment on their market readiness level and their technology readiness level. And you can actually see where they have scored based on this. You can also see, as a project has gone on for a while, you can see how projects have developed, how they've improved their market and technology readiness level too. And based on this analysis, we've actually formed clusters around projects which are of a low market readiness level and projects which have a target of a higher technology readiness level. Now, I mentioned our Oxford University taxonomy, but in the lifetime of our project, which has been quite long, we've also seen the emergence of the JRC taxonomy, which is the key cybersecurity reference, if you like, for the European Commission. So we've worked this in, you see, so you can also identify projects in the radar based on the various elements of the JRC taxonomy. The projects are tagged by these topics, and you can tag one or more, and the radar will come up with statistical information, like you can see in the slide here, regarding the number of projects funded in the period, the types of projects, the average duration, total duration, and the average budget spent here. And you can, this is an example from the health projects which cover the health sector and cover the topic of data security and privacy, and projects themselves. So this is a very interactive tool, and projects can manage their own entries here. So what I'd like to do is always challenging on these types of events is try and show you directly the radar. So wish me luck as I do this. Has my browser gone? Here it is. Okay, so you should be able to see my browser. This is reachable via the Cyberwatching website. So you go to Cyberwatching.eu and you'll find the radar right on our homepage. You have some information boxes at the top to explain the type of information I've just described. And here you can see the various pieces of the landscape and the radar itself. So each blip represents a project. You can search for a project if you like. So we can search for ReAct, and you can find where ReAct is basically. Oops, on the radar, it's 151. Okay, and you can find out more information about the project here. You can see where it is in the radar itself, and you can see how the project has tagged itself too. And if you go to this box here, you are taken to the ReAct page on our website. Each project has their own website page which they can manage, and you can see here the event in today's webinar. So let's take, for example, you're interested in, I don't know, this section here, so secure systems. You can click here and you have basically a high-level overview of all of the projects, which is the main area that projects have been funded in, and you can click on each project and get that type of information. Again, you can click on their performance too, and you can see how the project has developed since we started collecting data from them in terms of their market and technology readiness levels. I'll just come out of here. As I mentioned, there is the JRC taxonomy filter. This is probably one of the most interesting parts of the radar. So if you're looking for another project, or if you're looking for projects on a specific topic, then which could be a vertical sector, it could be a technology based on the JRC taxonomy. So again, as I said, the projects have tagged themselves, so I can look for blockchain, and you can find the various projects which have been either are currently active, which are the ones in the inner circles, or are past their life cycle. You can also get this statistical information. I think this is quite interesting to understand how many projects are working or have worked in the field of blockchain. And of course, you can also add, I don't know, if we want to look at education and training to see if any of these projects also do education and training. You can see that 3 of them do. 2 of them are 2 competence center pilot projects. So in short, the radar is something that we are in discussions with the JRC and the European Commission in terms of it being a bird's eye view of the landscape and what is happening here. There's unique information in terms of the relative performance of projects and in terms of their market and technology readiness level. You can see the Cyberwatching project, which has just finished, for example, and you can, find out information about the project and its relative performance compared to the other projects. So it's an important signposting and promotional resource for the projects themselves, and a resource for policymakers. And also with the new work program coming up, you can also use the radar to identify projects which are working in a specific area or field, and get in touch with them, because of course you can by going on their page, you can find out more information about the project, and you can access their results at the bottom of the page, which is also an important aspect. So and you can contact them directly right here. Okay, so these are all resources to support projects in terms of visibility and promoting their activities and their results. So I will just go back to my presentation. So as I said, the benefits are wide-ranging, from policymakers to the research community, and in particular project coordinators or partners wanting to find collaboration points. And also we've used it with standardization bodies who are interested in finding out, for example, which projects were working on blockchain and standards. So we've really seen the benefit of it. But with all this investment, 1.1 billion, where are the tangible results? So as I just showed you on the Cyberwatching page, the project is able to also publish results on their page. So here we're thinking about maybe resources, there's many projects which are providing resources or services for companies or the SME community, or even public administrations as well. And we have the marketplace as well as one of our key outputs, where we have over 140 different results from EC funded projects, rubbing shoulders with small businesses who are also able to publish their innovation, and the innovation is the key word here, in the marketplace. So we have behind this, we have a really cool website, I have to say, user profiled, and all of the information is funneled from the project side, the research side, into something which is much more results based, which is the marketplace. So I've said that the radar will be sustained beyond our project lifetime by Trust IT, who I work for, and Oxford University. So we want to keep this going. We want to keep it as a resource for the community. And the marketplace itself, because it's so interactive, because it's a place which allows a user to search for products, and it allows a provider to contact them, and also to provide updated information constantly. The marketplace will become sustained by the European Cybersecurity Organization, who will adopt it as their SME registry. So this means that, well, it's an extremely positive result for for the Cyberwatching project, but interestingly, for projects, it's a gateway to get their results really, really viewed. It's, you know, what an EC-funded project can do in the SME space is relatively limited, but what EXO can do is much more, much broader because of their weight and importance in the cybersecurity landscape. So in terms of supporting SMEs, SMEs are often the focus of a lot of projects in cybersecurity. And we know that this is key and an important future area for EXO. And it's also they form the backbone of the European economy, basically. And they are more susceptible to attacks. And although they don't particularly think that they are, so they you know, not a lot of money is invested in cybersecurity. It's seen as an IT problem, not really a human problem. And you know, time and effort is money for an SME. I know because I work for one, and I've worked for one when we were a micro enterprise with only 5 people in one room. So this is a real challenge. Cybersecurity is often a second thought, as was said at the very beginning of the webinar, but it can be a differentiator and really make the difference for a small company or a startup. So to support this, clearly any company needs help, in particular with the busy landscape and the increasing amount of regulations that are coming through, which are excellent practice and, you know, being pushed through the Cybersecurity Act and the European Commission. And companies, you know, often turn to consulting to get support. And there are more and more self-assessment resources online, but which one is best to trust? The ultimate step for any organization is to have their services accredited by a third independent party, which is certification, which for an SME is a major step in terms of resources and money. So it's something which is often a bridge too far, if you like. So as part of our project, we also provide this little step in the middle, which is encouraging companies to carry out self-assessment and to be a bit more reflective on the cybersecurity practices that they provide. A key output that's coming up in June is a cybersecurity seal, which we've developed with SGS, which is a major player in cybersecurity standards in Europe. And this is basically, we're very excited about this because this is a very, very robust and trusted service that we'll be offering to the SME community through the Cybersecurity Hub in Spain, with both Italian and Spanish versions. And this is a key resource for any small business to basically understand where they stand and be better informed when they go and get advice or they want to speak to the certification authority. It also gets them into the right mind of improving how to improve cybersecurity. There are also other resources that we have, one related to managing risk in cybersecurity. And you see the partners that we have in our consortia are the key people providing us. Here we have Aon, and also in terms of security, privacy and GDPR, we have two really cool resources, online tools, where companies can understand where they are in terms of receiving a sanction, because that's the really important thing. Am I going to be fined for being for not following the GDPR? So that's my presentation over now. I'd like to invite you all to the session we have tomorrow. Even if you come for a little part of it, it's going to be very interesting. We have some important speakers coming, and then we have some really great workshops coming up through June on standards and certification, where we will be launching the cybersecurity seal. And then later, late June or early July, we'll be having a session, hopefully with the European Commission, on the new work program. and focusing on the variety of roadmaps that exist in different organizations. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas. And in the interest of time, we're moving to the next presentation by Michalis Polychronakis from Stony Brook University. He's faculty there, and he talks today about defending against memory corruption, vulnerability exploitation. Welcome, Michalis.
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to give this talk to this workshop. Very good to see many friends. So yeah, I will be talking about our research in the past few years on defending against memory corruption vulnerabilities. I hope you all know about this problem, and it's not be hard to convince you that it's a really important problem, because it's one of the leading causes for system compromise and malware infection. And the root cause of this is that we have to live with a lot of C and C++ code that is everywhere, right? We still write code in C and C++, and these are unsafe languages, as we call. The programmer has a lot of flexibility on how they can manage the hardware, the memory, and this leads to a continuous introduction of bugs that can turn into serious vulnerabilities, right? And we do have memory safe languages that don't suffer from these problems. It's just that they have much more overhead. The developers are not very familiar with them. We have so much existing C and C++ code that we cannot just throw away and rewrite everything in one day. There have been very promising steps recently, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this. But the fact is that if you look into the zero-day exploits that have been plaguing browsers and operating systems, in most cases, the exploit relies on a memory corruption vulnerability to hijack the control flow of the vulnerable process and compromise the machine. So this website tracks all the zero-day exploits against web browsers, and you can see that most of them, the recent ones from the past year, have to do with memory corruption. Google also is tracking all the zero-day exploits that they observe in the wild, and these target not only browsers but operating systems, iOS, things like that. And some bugs are logic or design flaws, but the majority, again, are memory corruption vulnerabilities. So how can we defend against these vulnerabilities, right? So the research community and the industry have been following basically three directions, I would say. The first one is to find and kill the bugs. So there have been so many techniques that we are all using: sanitizers, fuzzing, symbolic execution. Companies have now bug bounties to encourage people to go poke around and find bugs in their services or software. But the problem with this approach is that it is not scalable. We will never eradicate all the bugs, because we continuously introduce new bugs, because there's so much new code being written. And the other problem is that the same thing can be done by both people who are really interested in improving security and people who just want to use these exploits for various malicious purposes, right? So both defenders and attackers can do this, and this means that these techniques also, in one way, make exploitation easier, because now the attackers can also find bugs in a more scalable and efficient way. The other line of research, especially in academia, aims to retrofit memory safe into C and C++. We do have memory safe languages, Java, for many decades, actually, right? Java, JavaScript, these days Rust and Go are very promising. So we do know how to implement memory safe languages. The problem is that the flexibility of C and C++ is in conflict to the stricter memory models that these languages enforce. And retrofitting memory safety into C and C++ code, especially the existing code bases, faces many compatibility issues, and let alone the performance overhead, right? So this is probably one of the main reasons why we don't really have managed to automatically transform C and C++ code into a memory safe variant. And I think we've been working on this problem for so long that I don't think this will be ever done. What will be done and what has already started happening is that we have started rewriting critical components of software in the new generation of memory safe languages like Rust and Go that in terms of performance are very, very good. They are almost the same level, especially Rust is almost the same level of C++. So the performance overhead concern is out of the way. The only thing that remains is to start rewriting code in Rust or Go. And people have started doing this, right? So Firefox, for example, already ships with maybe 1, 2, 3% of its code written in Rust. I don't know, Amazon has released the Firecracker virtual machine monitor, which is written in Rust. You know, promising steps are being made. And I think this is a very viable approach toward the future. But the problem, one problem remains with memory safety, and that is that it does not does not defend against and does not protect against all these new wave of transit execution attacks that we have recently seen, right? All these hardware level vulnerabilities that allow an attacker to leak memory and bypass all these memory safety and restrictions and boundaries. We don't really have good solutions and good memory isolation techniques to defend against them. And even memory safe languages are vulnerable to these attacks. So part of our research also focuses on mitigating this problem. And the third line of research is work on exploit mitigations, right? So, and this is probably one of the most practical techniques and lines of research that has introduced the meaningful benefits in the systems we use every day, right? So a Windows machine from 15 years ago compared to a Windows machine these days are completely different in terms of how secure they are. And the main reason is that, first of all, you know, the whole development process is much more reasonable and has security as a priority, but also there are so many exploit mitigations, that is, techniques and mechanisms embedded in the code and the operating system that if a vulnerability is still found by an attacker, it will make it hard for them to exploit it. And this is probably the main focus of my talk today. So the research we're doing is on exploit mitigations that we can retrofit on software to mitigate vulnerabilities. And we say that exploit mitigations raise the bar for exploitation. An example, I like to give is always like, if you look what was happening 10, 15 years ago, you could find a bug in a browser and exploit it in a few hours, right? That was a state of security in the browsers and other critical piece of software we're using back in 2007, for example. And if you look 10 years after, finding an equivalent and exploiting an equivalent bug in a browser takes teams of really skilled researchers working for maybe months to pull it off, right? Why? Because it's not only enough to find the bug anymore, you have to also jump around and bypass all these mitigations, and probably you have to change several vulnerabilities together to achieve code execution. So exploit mitigations do work, but also can be bypassed, right? And if you look into the history of how attack techniques and mitigations have been introduced and bypassed, there's a coevolution of attacks and defenses. And these days, it is still possible to bypass all the mitigations that are in place. It's just much, much harder. And a common technique that all exploits basically use in the past 10, 15 years is code reuse, this return-oriented programming technique that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, right? So if you consider instructions in a program as the words in this message, an attacker can use the existing instructions in a program and also instructions that are embedded within the instructions of the program, right? So any byte sequence that exists in executable memory on a system can be interpreted as code and executed, right? So this means that the code that exists in a system helps the attacker exploit a vulnerability. And this is why, and there are two reasons this is possible, right? The first one is that we all use the same software, right? So we all use the same operating system. There are a few variants, but the actual code of the operating system or the actual code of a browser is the same, right? So we have what we call a monoculture of software. And this means that if the attacker finds some code sequence that exists in a vulnerable process, they know that they can rely on this exact sequence to be present in the victim's machine. So code verification is one technique to undermine this assumption of the attackers, and we have done a lot of work on this in the past. And the other direction where we've been looking in the past 3-4 years is, okay, the code helps the attacker. What if we can at least reduce the amount of code that exists in there just to make their life a bit harder, right? And there is a lot of code, and we call this code bloat, right? So the software, I'm sure all of you have used, I don't know, Slack or any other Electron-based application on your laptops. And for a simple chat application, you need 2 GB of memory, right? So it's just the way we write software these days is so inefficient, and we rely on so many packages and libraries and frameworks that introduce so much code in there, which helps the attacker to write exploits and also may have more bugs in there, right? That's why we do a lot of work in reducing the attack surface, as we say, by removing this code. And even if we manage to prevent exploitation and achieving arbitrary execution, then we have to worry about all these other data leakage attacks, right? So maybe the attacker cannot hijack the execution of the code, but through just leaking memory, they can achieve their goal. They can leak passwords, private keys, other sensitive data from a process, right? So the Heartbleed vulnerability was a good example. And also all these new attacks that rely on Trojan execution and these hardware bugs make it even harder, right? So even if all the exploit mitigations we have managed to introduce solve the problem of code execution, we still have to worry about data leakage. And for some reason, these data leakage vulnerabilities come with nice logos. So this is the other goal of our research these days, right? So we want to implement data isolation technologies that will be good against also Trojan execution attacks. So in the rest of the 10 minutes I have, I guess, or 5 minutes, I will try to go very quickly through a few highlights of the work we've been doing in this direction, right? And let me start by code specialization. So I talked about how the way we write software these days relies on frameworks and libraries, and this introduces so much code into a process. But usually what happens is that not all the code that exists in a process is actually needed. Some libraries may not even be needed at all according to a certain configuration. Or even if we use a library, we don't really use all the functions that are provided from this API. Usually we use just a handful of functions and the rest stay there for someone to use, but this particular program will never use it. So this code bloat increases the attack surface in many directions, right? So as I said, first of all, there may be bugs in this unnecessary code, right, that someone can exploit. And actually Heartbleed exploited a vulnerability in a part of the code that nobody used, right? But the code was still there. Why? Because nobody bothered to remove it. And the more code you have, the more instructions available for an attacker to write rough exploits and achieve their goals. And the same for system calls. An operating system has to be as generic as possible to support any kind of application. But for a particular application, not all system calls are needed, especially dangerous ones like execv or system calls that change memory permissions, right? So these are precious system calls for exploit code, but if we can remove them because the application does not need them, then we can improve security. And also, when it comes to privilege escalation vulnerabilities, the implementation of system calls in the kernel also has bugs, and these bugs can turn into privilege escalation vulnerabilities. So by removing system calls, we also lower the possibility of an attacker to perform privilege escalation attacks. So this is a theme of our research in this area. And let me give you a few examples. So this is a configuration for Nginx, right? So this particular web server wants to do, I don't know, resize images, and this requires libgd. It wants to perform regular expression matching and needs libpcre. It wants to parse XML and needs libxml and so on, right? The problem is that, so this configuration is not really a common configuration. Most users just want to serve a website, and the default configuration of Nginx does not use all these libraries. But you don't have any option, right? If you install Nginx and run it, all these libraries are loaded in memory, even if your configuration does not use them, right? And we studied the default configuration of various server applications and found out that when you use the default configuration of Nginx, for example, you can remove 77% of its code because it's not needed. Like 25 out of the 33 libraries that are loaded are not needed at all, and you can remove them, right? So 3/4 of the code of Nginx with a default configuration is not needed at all, and you can safely remove it. For VSFTPD, this is like about half of the code, and for OpenSSH, we could remove only 20% of the code, right? So depending on the configuration and the application, a lot of code may not be needed. And also when we looked a lot into containers, where we have this huge problem of privilege escalation attacks. There have been so many container escape vulnerabilities in which attackers exploit vulnerabilities in the system calls that are provided by the underlying kernel to take full control of the machine, right? Docker already prohibits access to a bunch of rarely used system calls, just 44 of them. And this is enforced by applying a second BPF filter during the initialization of the container. But Linux provides more than 300 system calls. And we asked the question, do all containers really need all those system calls, or can we maybe enforce a more strict filter to block more of those system calls and reduce the possibility of privilege escalation attacks? So we built a system that does exactly this, and it does it in a static analysis way. So you don't have to run it with workloads and train it or anything like that. You just take the container image, you process it with our tool, and what you get as an output is a ready-to-use second filter that you can apply on your container. And the results were kind of impressive to us because we used data set of 150 Docker containers, and for half of them, we could disable 145 or more system calls, right? So more than half, like about half of the system calls that are provided by the operating system can be disabled. And even in the worst case, we could still remove 100 system calls. This is more than double the system calls that Docker already blocks. And if you look into the vulnerabilities that now don't exist anymore because you cannot even trigger them, we mapped the existing CVs to the corresponding system call implementation code in the kernel, and we found that about 28 CVs were removed by applying this filter, which is a nice reduction in the attack surface of the kernel. And we have done more work on this. We have also looked into the behavior of the process across time and enforced more strict filters after the initialization process. So for example, Apache and Nginx have execv available there for an attacker to use. But if you look at it, they need it only during initialization. So after Apache and Nginx start, you can just go and remove execv, and now an attacker cannot use it anymore. And we have also looked into how we can specialize the remaining API calls. And let me finish by just a couple of slides on data protection, which I believe is a very, very important problem. And as I said, not only because existing memory corruption vulnerabilities can be used, like Heartbleed, can be used to leak secrets from memory, like passwords and private keys and configuration files and anything like that. But also we have all these transit execution attacks that now can leak secret data, sensitive data from the cache, like Spectre, or from CPU buffers, as was the case with zombie load. And even if you have all these hardware enforced isolation mechanisms like SGX, these have been shown to be bypassable. For example, Foreshadow is another variation that bypasses SGX. Intel has this memory protection keys, memory protection key isolation technology. Again, this can be bypassed by Meltdown, same for the kernel memory. So basically, there have been so many transit execution attacks, any piece of data probably can be leaked, no matter how you protect it, right? So we thought about this problem and came up with the idea of just encrypting the data in memory, like as part of the application code, and make sure the data remains encrypted everywhere until it's about to be used, right? So if the actual use of, what does it mean for a program to use data? It will perform some computation on it, right? And this computation will happen only when the data actually is loaded on the CPU registers, in which point we can decrypt it, perform the computation we want, then re-encrypt it and send it back to memory. So all these leakage attacks will still happen, can still happen, and tomorrow maybe new leakage attacks may be discovered, but all they can leak is encrypted data, not the actual plain text data. So basically we treat the hardware as an untrusted network. In the same way we encrypt our traffic on the internet because we don't trust anything on the internet, in the same way we encrypt the data in the machine because we don't trust anything on the machine anymore. That's the idea, I guess. So doing this is very, very challenging. We have to find, let's say we want to make it easier for the programmer, right? So we want the program to just say, this variable is sensitive, please protect it, right? Now, this is nice for the programmer, but to actually do this, we have to figure out where this data flows, and all the points in the program that accesses data have to be instrumented to encrypt and decrypt the data accordingly, right? And this is a very, very challenging task to do in terms of static analysis. We don't really have good scalable pointer analysis technologies to do this. That's why we came up with the idea to combine both static and dynamic analysis to solve this problem, right? So if this is a data flow graph of a program, static analysis can give you everything. It's sound, but also it will give you so many more things that are not really needed because it suffers from over approximation. On the other hand, if you do dynamic analysis, you get full precision, but it's unsound because you're going to definitely miss some parts that you didn't exercise, right? So we combine both so that we still use static analysis to ensure that all code is covered, but then we don't instrument all these data points, but we do some lightweight data flow tracking at runtime to make sure we apply encryption and decryption only on data that is really, really sensitive. And we will be presenting this work next week, actually, in SMP. So yeah, I think these are the two main lines of research we've been working on, and I believe are important. We want to reduce the attack surface through software specialization and make sure really critical data like cookies and passwords and private keys remain safe in memory. Many of these prototypes are open source, so please download them and play with them, and we'll be happy to receive your feedback. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Michalis, for this nice overview. And with this, I would like to start the last panel. Let me see, to share my slides in order to introduce also the panelists. So, okay, so we have the last panel session, Defending Systems 20 Years Later. We have 5 panelists. I think all of them were already on stage, right? You should, or Davide, I think can you please introduce yourself, because I think you were not involved in discussion so far, right?
No, I was not. So hi, Torsten. So hi, everyone. My name is Davide Balzerotti. I'm a professor and the head of the digital security department at Eurocom. And I do research in system security broadly, like in many different topics of system security. And I'm part of the ReAct project as well, where I lead WP5 on the forensic analysis part.
Thank you, Davide. And with this, I would like to start with the first question. Maybe coming back to this, to the intro slide. Defending systems 20 years later, we already heard in Michalis' presentation that there's a huge difference if you take a look at Windows, let's say Windows 95 or later versions and Windows 10. So we have seen lots of things that have improved in the past 20 years. And I want to first start with a question as, what do you see as one of the most important milestones we have reached? So there have been many things that happened in the past 20 years. Many new techniques were either presented at academic conferences or were actually introduced into products. What do you see as some kind of game changer, if any? Is there anything that you would like to highlight?
Who goes
Wants to
first?
start?
Yeah. Go, Davide.
I go. I'm very. I don't know. If I had to start, I would say that I don't think there was anything. I think we had a lot of different improvements. So depending on which side of security you like the most, you will find that we really went a long way from 20 years ago. There was nothing 20 years ago. Compilers had no security. There was not even stack canary 20 years ago. So I think everywhere you look, like you could just get all the passwords from the network. There was nothing encrypted. I think, frankly, we did an amazing job in almost everywhere in security. However, I think maybe as a game changer, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that I'm not so convinced that even nowadays we are more secure than 20 years ago. I think one thing is saying that it's harder to exploit system today, which it is, obviously, right? So as Mihalis already said, like if you try to exploit now an overflow on a browser, I mean, then you really need to use some ninja move in order to get code execution. 20 years ago, I mean, just return on the stack and execute code. However, we were defending also against mostly script kiddies 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I'm not so sure if my computer is more safe now than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I had maybe 20 viruses on my system and I was living with them. I was happy. I know, I could name them and say, okay, most of them are harmless. Nowadays, if you get compromised, it's not, you're not that lucky. So I think we went a long way, but I think the bad guys also, improved a lot. We also helped them a bit with, we do a lot of research, of course, to discover new attacks, but they're pretty good also by themselves. So I don't know, maybe you guys have some idea of something that really, where we really improve faster than the attackers, let's say.
Yeah,
sure.
I think, so I totally agree. This is very positive, right? You don't afraid to connect a laptop to the internet anymore, like compared to 10 years, like all these drive-by download attacks, they don't really exist at that level. They do exist. We saw the 0 days out there, but they are used very, very precisely for certain targets and so on, right? And I think so this is definitely one positive aspect. And I really like the recent focus on user authentication, strong authentication. There's a movement towards passwordless logins, and this is tied also with stronger endpoint visibility, getting rid of firewalls and all the perimeters and all this older way of thinking about how you have to set up a company network or a corporate network. I think this is moving away, and we'll have a new generation of, new technologies, stronger guarantees for your endpoint devices, like think about Chromebooks and things like that. Stronger at least about the person behind the laptop, right? With two-factor authentication and biometrics and all these things, and better visibility. And everything is encrypted. You don't have firewalls anymore and things like that. So I think this is a good way. I think all the past experience led us to this point, and I think this will make things much, much better for the future. I try to be positive.
If I may add something, just a comment. I think I agree with all the aforementioned comments, but I think the milestone that we reached, especially by demonstrating all these attacks and how easy it is to exploit the system, is that we made security a priority, especially in very popular software. So we now have like browsers that employ a lot of custom defenses, like multiple heap allocators for the JavaScript and so on, sandboxes inside. And I think we managed to make the attackers not to be able to exploit the software using just a single bug, just a single vulnerability. Now you need to find many vulnerabilities, and chaining the vulnerabilities is not fun anymore. So you have to invest a lot.
And also the industry people on the panel, what do you see in practice maybe as your favorite tool or your favorite milestone? Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe on my side, I mean, it's a massive oversimplification in a way. I mean, when it started my PhD in similar, you had just to deploy a server-side honeypot on the internet, and you could claim to have a reasonable picture of the type of attacks that were going on there. Then suddenly, the attack surface for the servers got closed because people started to realize, oh yeah, I shouldn't expose SMB services to the internet. I should use firewalls and similar. And we had the switch to client-side attacks. We had, especially 3 or 4 years ago, we had a lot of very large campaigns using drive-by downloads. Both of those, little by little disappeared. I mean, nowadays, basically, for attackers to compromise, attackers can still, of course, enter anywhere they want, but they have to involve the user. Now, if I look at recent campaigns like Amethyst or similar things, most of them, there is a user involvement in order to enter into the systems. I mean, we seem to have done a decent job, at least, at closing the perimeter and forcing attackers that want to actually enter into an enterprise network to realize, okay, yeah, I want to be able to do in a completely automated way. I need to go through a weak link that is normally is a human that clicks on the phishing link or similar things and allows me to penetrate the enterprise network. In a way, this is a good change in a way. But I also agree with David that I'm not sure if we are actually more secure nowadays than we were 20 years ago, because the bar has raised for both attackers and defenders.
Yeah, my counterpoint would be a bit that SolarWinds actually nicely demonstrated that supply chain attacks can still get you into thousands of companies by just compromising one other company. Nicolas, also any thoughts on this?
Yeah.
Or
so I think we have seen these incremental steps that have made the ecosystem more secure. I also don't think that there is like something major that was, that shifted gears in the whole ecosystem. I think it's more like vulnerabilities being patched and then again and again, perhaps with, I think I would say the other way around, that with the, let's say, invention of smartphones and this kind of more ubiquitous kind of devices, we have seen an explosion of new threats and the landscape changed. But with respect to tools and being able to suppress these kind of threats, I would say that we have moved incrementally. At least that's how I have experienced it.
Yeah, incremental. I agree that we saw many improvements. So probably CFI, so control for integrity, is one of my main milestones I would see. And then also return-oriented programming on the offensive side. But lots of incremental things have happened, but incremental but steady. So we've seen quite a lot of improvements over time. So let's move to a bit to the future. What do you see as some kind of gap or enhancement that we should focus on? So we've seen actually quite a lot of attacks are successful in practice. We see that attackers seem to be in a very easy way to compromise systems if they put a lot of effort in, at least. So what should we focus on as a community in order to basically close more gaps or make it harder for an attacker?
Probably IoT. I think it feels to me that it's a deja vu, right? We know that IoT will take over the space or a major part of this space in the next 1 or 2 decades, but we already start seeing a repetition of attacks, and it feels that the systems have not, we have not learned, let's say. We see the similar attacks or similarly vulnerable smart devices in the houses appearing all over the place. And as a community, I think we need to push further for the industry to apply whatever we have learned in the last 20 years. So we don't need to repeat the same things.
Yeah, if I can jump on this, I agree. It's not that we don't know how to make secure IoT devices, right? there are some that are secure and they have not been hacked, but there are so many others that are just not developed in the proper way, right?
Right.
So I think if something we should focus on is making security seamless and easy to deploy, right? Because we do have the technologies and we do know how to create secure systems, but good luck convincing a company with 1,000 employees tomorrow to switch to Beyond Corp and passwordless and get rid of their firewalls and VPNs. It's not going to happen, right? So how we move from the existing state of affairs to applying all the new technologies and new proper ways of writing software to existing shops and companies, I think it's very, very difficult. I don't know. And maybe it's outside our research, like we focus on the technical aspects and we try to improve security from a technical perspective, but then you have all these other usability and policy problems probably that, I don't know, are important and nobody cares about.
Yeah, I wanted to ask this. So do we need more regulations or more policies in order to make sure that the IoT manufacturers actually take some kind of responsibility or are somehow liable for vulnerabilities in their systems? But this is then, of course, not technical, but more on the policy side.
They were proposing the same thing for normal computers 15 years ago, right? To try to introduce some liability, and that never happened. So I don't think this is going to happen now for IoT. But I mean, it will happen a bit, like certified by Visa, like if you have the checklist that you need to do, probably yes. But
here in the US, there were some steps, right? So there was a mandate a few weeks ago, I think, that new guidance from the government, you should be doing two-factor, for example. I think this is good. It wouldn't hurt for sure, right? In the same way, you cannot sell a car without seatbelts. This, I think it's good, right? So, but it's not the only thing we have to do, I think.
Something that we should keep in mind is lots of times we think of regulation as constraining things, but the biggest test, I think, in the last few years was GDPR, and it actually had showed that it can be a market generator of new companies, of new innovation, etc. So if all of a sudden tomorrow the governments around the world were to make regulation to make security and patching and blah blah obligatory, you would have a whole new well, not market per se, but a lot more work to be done from the security companies, and you would eventually have a more secure space.
Yeah, GDPR is a nice example because they are the regulation actually forced everyone to change their typical way of procedures. But on the other hand, it also had some, I would say, unintended side effects. That basically on each website you open, you get this cookie banner now. So regulations are tough to get right in practice.
Yeah, but now that is zero, I guess. Sorry.
No, I was saying that when you do something like this, it's always unclear if eventually you improve the security or you just add, regulation that then people try to find a shortcut or another way around them, and then you're left with the, just clicking on like 3,000, little things with your finger every time that you want to visit on a website, and maybe you're tracked exactly the same. So it's always tricky when you make regulations, right? So the incentives, it's always not always perfectly in line with the objective, and then you maximize maybe for the wrong thing. But I believe that something needs to be done. I mean, because again, as Mihalis was saying, this is not a problem of technology, a problem of research. This is just a problem of adopting what we already know. And
exactly.
So,
I mean, so yes, GDPR, I mentioned it as an example for us to understand what impact such a regulation can have. But if you were to think of a GDPR regulation that is for security, we would be talking about, for example, a new publisher showing up on the web. They have to have a list of things that they need to tick that secures their backend systems plus the side of the user, the front end that they access, right? And a new browser that shows up around, they have to have a checklist, a new bank that comes, blah, blah. So we wouldn't rely only on certification from ISO kind of groups that, oh yeah, I'm ISO certified for this and that and so on. If I ask you, is the bank that you collaborate with, that you have an account, is it certified? You will tell me, I don't know, probably, right? You rely on that company, thinking that, oh, it's good to have in my website that I'm ISO, blah, 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 or that I am certified by the government, etc. So yeah, maybe certification is one pseudo way, middle way.
Okay, coming back from the policy back to the technical level, because we heard in the previous two sessions a lot about attacks, all these crazy side channel attacks and everything. But what do you see in practice? So I don't want to discredit the practicality of side channel attacks, of course, but still in practice, probably there are not that many attacks that take Rowhammer or Meltdown or Spectre as a first step into the system. So therefore, maybe I should rephrase this a bit. In order to improve our defenses, so basically how to defend our systems against software-based attacks, what do you think are there the greatest challenges, or what should we as a community work on?
So for software in particular, I think that we made a lot of hardening defenses that made things harder for the attackers, but maybe it's time to move on some more radical approaches, like use programming systems that have some memory safety guarantees. I think Michalis mentioned that you can use Rust. It's hard to rewrite everything in Rust or Go. Maybe we can start like rewriting some of the very critical components there. And I'm sure that if new programmers, new engineers start using Rust and try to write more code in Rust, then things will become easier to expand the Rust code base or the Go code base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but still C and C++ are among the top 3 programming languages, according to some.
I'm pretty sure, yeah. And they were invented in the 70s, and there are like 50 years with us. Yeah, I mean, it's maybe the time to think a bit different.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think we're done with this. There's it's not a viable way to continue writing C and C++ code. I think we're done. Major vendors, major players have started writing Rust. I think in 10, 15 years, things will have improved in that sense. And you don't have to rewrite everything, right? You just have to write the parsers, the renderers, things like that. So there will be a very long transition period, I guess. But yeah, but many startups, many companies these days, they just use Go for all their servers, right? So, and this is much, much better.
Then there's a quick question to the 3 academics on the panel. Do you still teach C to your students?
So I just sent the grades yesterday for my network security course, and everything was in Go.
Great.
And last 2017, when I taught it again, everything was in C. So maybe I'm in this transition mode.
I actually have to teach a little bit of C in order to convey the how memory corruption works. So yeah.
Yeah, for my offensive security course, we still show the bugs in C. Yeah.
I teach how to reverse C more than how to write C, I think.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
But again, I mean, this is another problem that is not a research problem, right? So yes, I mean, we should stop using C, but that's not something I can decide, or is not something that, especially as a researcher in academia, there's not much I can do about it. I mean, it's
true, yeah, the practical adoption. In the previous session, we talked about that, or this a bit the trade-off. If you do offensive research, then the papers seem to get accepted a bit more easily these days. defense papers have a harder time to get accepted. So still, there are probably a lot of challenges that we need to solve on the defensive side. But
of
with
course,
this, yes, Nicholas.
About the language, you do have all the legacy systems out there, right? So if you started teaching now, go pro, imagine what's going to happen, like when this is going to be adopted in the mainstream systems, maybe 20 years from now.
Yeah, so many of my students, it was their first time to write Go.
Yeah.
And at the end they said, okay, thank you, because I lacked it, right? So maybe we'll have to, prod people to try it, right?
I totally agree. I'm just saying that they will graduate with the security, let's say, focus. They will go to a company to become security researchers or engineers or whatever, and they will hit the wall of C and C++ code, and they will call you and ask you,
well, you ruined that.
Yeah.
No, so the opposite may happen. So they may start rewriting stuff in Go. Convince their managers that, oh, this is horrible, I cannot touch it, I have to rewrite it.
Yeah.
I think they will write it in JavaScript probably.
No JS, everything, and Electron, and done.
So as you can see, not all the improvements are good, right? Now you start writing everything in JavaScript and it's like, okay, how did we get there?
Yeah.
We have one question in the Q&A window from Manolis. He asked, has software engineering started moving towards a hybrid safe, unsafe language model? I would say yes, to a certain extent, if you take a look at Rust, for example. But
Oh yeah, I just wanted to mention that Firefox already, if you use Firefox, you use Rust, right? So part of its code is written in Rust. And Elias has done work on this.
Yeah. Docker as well, I think. Docker has Go. Yeah, there are many very popular products out there that use a little bit of Go or a little bit of Rust. And I think that
Amazon Firecracker also. All the serverless stuff that Amazon runs on top of Rust.
Maybe to ask a follow-up question on Manolis, how is the interaction between the two, let's say, worlds, between the safe and the safe within the same program? How does it get negotiated? Is that okay? Does that work?
Well, both languages provide APIs in order to call unsafe code, and there might be complications there for sure. But if we move and evolve this model, I think there will be workarounds.
Okay. Because I guess it goes back to the question of Thorsten on the screen. I mean, now we have, let's say, enhancements on hardware like TEs and this kind of, let's say, additions that can help to execute something in a more secure environment or, let's say, trusted environment. But I wonder when we start mixing languages within the same code, what happens? But yeah.
Yeah, but so with Rust, you have, for example, the unsafe keyword. So the programmer has a mechanism to basically tell the compiler that the next piece of code is unsafe. And then we somehow force the programmer to at least think about what are the implications of doing certain operations. Of course, things can go wrong in the unsafe code, and this then jeopardizes the whole system. But still, these are small regions of the whole program, and the programmer needs to at least think about what can go wrong.
Yeah, it's usually in these boundaries that the leaks happen and where things need to be studied. Yeah.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, or 7 minutes. So moving on to the third question, what we see is that security also gets more complex. So I mentioned the SolarWinds attack, so typical supply chain attack. Software complexity increases if you take a look at how many million lines of code a modern browser has. We have machine learning integrated in many different types of systems, so it's still a bit unclear how can we actually test this ML components. We have more and more connectivity. We heard about IoT and others. And we've seen, so the threat surface gets bigger. And we've seen also many types of unknown type of attacks. So things like Meltdown or Spectre came a bit surprising, or Rowhammer, that you basically can, from the software level, attack the hardware level via flipping bits. So it seems like there are always new attack vectors coming up. What's a better way to anticipate these new or these unknown unknowns? Any idea how we can anticipate that the next, or what the next level or the next attack vector will or could look like?
A difficult question, Thorsten.
Yeah.
Maybe
this is more for researchers, maybe, and at least it's here.
Maybe with AI and generative models, like try to see it. So I said AI, but so imagine that you have a box full of attacks that you have seen in the past. You train some sort of gun, some sort of generative model, and then you try to create new attacks, right? That you would have never thought of. And you have a system trying to attack another system. Maybe that's what we will see in the next 5-10 years.
That's scary. The day in which AI will produce a new type of attack, that is maybe when I'm gonna disconnect from the internet.
Will solve your challenges, or your CTF challenges will be solved.
I think more than a solution, that may be the beginning of the end, I think.
But we will see that. I mean, AI is being used to create new drugs and solve problems that we have been kind of stuck, like protein fold and these kind of things. And it is trying to come up with solutions in a different way. So I don't see a reason why we wouldn't be able to use machine learning models to attack this kind of attack overload of the word. I think we got limited to the point of how much we can handle as maybe humans. I don't know.
It's a very interesting point, but at least for the moment, the way I see it is that the very new type of attacks, they're always new because they're outside our threat model, right? And I think we're still in the phase in which, even if you use machine learning, even if you use AI, whatever you want to call it, we need to provide probably this threat model. So we need to provide the boundaries within which the AI will explore. And I think that these very new attacks are typically things that are outside those boundaries. So on the long run, yeah, probably, I mean, we can all retire and the AI will do everything. But on the short run, I think for this very new type of attacks, they will still probably be discovered by hand, by humans. And that's why it's important to do research, you know, on attacks. I think our community is good at that. I mean, sometimes people, you know, complain that, you know, attack papers, they get in a bit easier, maybe, if it's true. But I don't see that as a bad thing. I mean, we need this sort of research because that's the one that pushes the boundary of our threat model. And so for me, that, you know, it's very important to understand that when we talk about research in security, we're talking about the people that try to design new solutions, but we're also talking about the people that try to adapt the threat model. They try to, you know, invent new attacks, or they try to do measurements to align our threat model with what happens in the reality. Otherwise, we just do research that is, you know, useless. So I think this activity will still be mostly done by good researchers. And maybe within the threat model, maybe, who knows, maybe AI, yes, will be able to sort of solve some of our problems and propose new solutions.
Yeah, I agree on the threat model. And I think it's good that now people have finally started thinking that the way you should think about security is what will happen if this machine is compromised, right? How can I contain the damage? And you know, ransomware has been devastating companies and hospitals and pipelines and everything because everything is one flat network, one flat infrastructure. There's no segmentation, no compartmentalization, no privileges, nothing, right? So it's just one flat surface. So finally, people get it, right? Finally, security administrators think in this way, have started. I hope they have started thinking the way, what will happen if the CEO's laptop is compromised? What will happen if this PLC in this machine gets compromised, right? So this is a way to think about it and start compartmentalizing and reducing privileges and things like that. I think we're going to move towards this way. And again, it's going to take decades probably.
And I agree on this. I mean, at least for the things that are within the threat model, I mean, like, you know, all this network virtualization stuff and so on and so forth should allow us to better ensure that, for instance, you know, the CEO laptop is now able to access the Git repos of the company because it shouldn't need to. And once that happens, probably, you know, these massive compromises would be at least less likely to happen. Of course, I mean, for stuff that is outside of our threat model, this does not work. But for that, we need the AI.
I think we should also expect to see combined threat models, like mixing things, like making attacks that combine different known attacks so far. And maybe we should not focus on protecting systems, but protecting assets, small informations, like a cryptographic key, as Michalis said. We may want to consider like the whole system will be compromised. Let's try to protect the asymmetric key, and it will be okay.
Okay, with this, we are at 5 p.m. So thanks a lot for these interesting insights. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the world where an AI or a machine learning system will detect the first new attacks. This will then be very challenging. Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm closing the last session and I'm now handing over to Evangelos with his closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Thorsten. Let me take the opportunity to thank all the speakers for their very interesting presentations, all the panelists for their very interesting discussions, and all the attendees who participated via the Q&A or who sent their questions in the chat. I hope that the event was beneficial for them. It was certainly beneficial for us. We got a lot of feedback. We were able to present our results. Thank you very much for that. And let me also thank Cyberwatching.eu for their collaboration in organizing this event and their very interesting presentations. So thank you all. And if you would like to get in touch with us, send us email. So thank you. Bye-bye from our side.